Look at me when I'm talking to you. I said, look at me. Get off me. No.
She had his jacket in both hands before he finished the word daughter. 2 fistfuls of Marpat collar, knuckles white, no wind up, no shout. Just her body moving across the plywood floor of the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Edinburgh, Helmand Province, at 0347 local on the 12th of August, 2011, and her hands closing on the lapels of a United States Marine Corps lieutenant colonel, and her face 6 inches from his. The 14 officers in the TOC did not move. The radio operator did not move. The Air Force Joint Terminal Attack Controller standing beside the strike package board, with the grease pencil still in his hand and the wrong grid coordinates still on the acetate, did not move. The fluorescent tube overhead made one small electrical tick, the way fluorescent tubes do in plywood buildings in the desert at 4 in the morning, and that tick was the only sound in the room for what the after-action report would later describe, with the dry precision of after-action reports, as a period of 6 seconds. 6 seconds. That is how long First Sergeant Idalia Mercado, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, out of Brownsville, Texas, stood with her hands on the lapels of Lieutenant Colonel Walker Brennan, commanding officer, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, out of Mobile, Alabama, in the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Edinburgh, on the morning of the 12th of August, 2011, before he looked at the map and saw what she had seen and changed the coordinates on the strike package and saved 31 Marines of her platoon from a 500-pound joint direct attack munition that was, at the moment she put her hands on him, approximately 90 seconds from release. 6 seconds is a long time when 14 officers are watching you commit, by the strictest reading of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, somewhere between 4 and 7 separate court-martial offenses. It is a longer time when you are right. It is the longest time in the world when you are right, and the man you have your hands on is the man who is going to decide, in those 6 seconds, whether the rest of your life is a court-martial or a promotion. He decided promotion. He decided it the next morning, alone, in her tent, with a piece of paper in his hand and the prerequisites waived by his own authority. He decided it again, 12 years later, in a sealed envelope on a selection board in Quantico, Virginia, with one sentence written in his own hand. The sentence was 9 words long. The sentence read, "She grabbed me. She was right. Promote her." That was the entire endorsement. 9 words. From a retired brigadier general who had, by the time he wrote those 9 words, been retired for 6 years and had not seen Idalia Mercado in person since the autumn of 2014. 9 words on Marine Corps letterhead, in blue ink, signed Brennan, Walker H. BGN USMC, read, and sealed, and mailed, and opened by a selection board for the highest enlisted billet in the United States Marine Corps. But I am getting ahead of myself. I always get ahead of myself with this one. I have been sitting with this story for a long time, and the temptation, when you have been sitting with a story for a long time, is to give you the ending before you have earned the beginning, because the ending is what made you sit with it in the first place. I am going to resist that temptation. I am going to back up. I am going to take you to Brownsville, Texas, in 1994, to a small house on Calle Adams 2 blocks south of Boca Chica Boulevard, where a 38-year-old widowed bricklayer named Tomas Mercado was sitting on the front porch in a folding aluminum lawn chair, talking, because Tomas Mercado was always talking, to his 9-year-old daughter, who was sitting on the porch step at his feet, listening, because Idalia Mercado, from the age of 4, was always listening. That is where we are going to start. The TOC will wait. The TOC has waited 11 years for me to tell this right. It can wait another 40 minutes. My name is Hatch Holloway. Pour yourself something. Sit down. This is going to take a while. Tomas Mercado was, by every account I have been able to gather from the people who knew him, the single most talkative man in the Rio Grande Valley between the years 1978 and 2017, which is the year he died, at the age of 61, of a heart attack he had been advertising to anyone who would listen for approximately 15 years. He talked at weddings. He talked at funerals. He talked at baptisms, at quinceañeras, at the counter of the H-E-B on Boca Chica, at the gas pump at the Stripes on Central, at the dentist's office while the dentist was working on his teeth, which the dentist, a patient man named Dr. Reyes, had asked him repeatedly not to do, and which Tomas had repeatedly continued to do. He talked to his customers while he laid brick. He talked to his apprentice while he laid brick. He talked to the brick. There is a Methodist church on Palm Boulevard in Brownsville whose entire south wall was, according to his apprentice of 11 years, a man named Beto Solis, laid one brick at a time while Tomas had a one-sided argument with the brick about whether Lyndon Johnson was a good president. He had not always been like this. According to his older sister, a woman named Esperanza Mercado de Villarreal, who is still alive and who lives in Harlingen and who I spoke with by telephone in the spring of 2022, Tomas was a quiet child. He was the youngest of 7. He read books. He drew pictures of birds in the margins of his school notebooks. He did not talk much, because in a house of 7 children and 2 working parents, the youngest child who did not talk much was, in his sister's words, the child who got fed last and asked to do dishes first, and Tomas figured that out early and kept his mouth shut for the first 16 years of his life. He started talking on the day his wife died. Her name was Lucila Mercado, née Cantu. She was 26 years old. She died on the 14th of March, 1986, in the maternity ward at Valley Baptist Medical Center in Brownsville, of an amniotic fluid embolism, which is a complication of childbirth that, in 1986, was almost uniformly fatal and is, in 2025, still fatal more often than not. She died approximately 47 minutes after the delivery of her first and only child, a daughter, who was healthy, who weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces, and who Lucila had named. In a conversation with Tomas 3 weeks before the delivery, Idalia, after Lucila's grandmother, who had crossed the river from Matamoros in 1921 at the age of 14 with a goat and 2 chickens and had built, by hand, the small house on Calle Adams in which Tomas and Lucila were, in 1986, still living. Tomas was 27 years old. He was holding the baby when the nurse came in to tell him that his wife was dead. The nurse, a woman named Carmen Delgado, who is also still alive and who I also spoke with, in the summer of 2022, at her house in San Benito, told me that Tomas did not cry. He did not collapse. He did not scream. He looked at the nurse. He looked at the baby. He looked at the nurse again. And then he began, very quietly, to speak. He spoke for 2 hours. Carmen Delgado told me that she had never, in 31 years of nursing, seen anything quite like it. He spoke to the baby. He spoke to the nurse. He spoke to the empty chair beside the bed where his wife had been. He spoke to the linoleum floor. He spoke about everything and nothing. He spoke about the weather, about the price of cement, about a man he had known in high school who had moved to Houston, about a dog his family had owned when he was 6 years old, about the color of the curtains in the maternity ward, about whether the curtains had always been that color or whether they had been changed recently. He spoke without stopping, without pausing, without seeming to breathe, for 2 hours, while the baby slept against his chest, and the nurses came and went, and the body of Lucila Mercado, née Cantu, was washed and wrapped and wheeled out of the room. When he stopped speaking, 2 hours later, he looked at Carmen Delgado, and he said, in a normal voice, "I think I need to go home now." And he stood up with the baby in his arms, and he walked out of the hospital, and he drove home in his truck, alone, at night, with a newborn in a cardboard box on the passenger seat. Because in 1986 in Brownsville, Texas, that is how the youngest of 7 children whose wife had just died drove a newborn home from the hospital. And he put the baby in the crib in the small bedroom that he and Lucila had painted yellow 3 months earlier, and he sat down on the floor next to the crib, and he started talking again. He talked, according to his sister Esperanza, who came down from Harlingen the next morning to help, for the next 31 years. He did not stop. He talked through the funeral. He talked through the wake. He talked through the first 9 months of Adalia's life, during which he learned to make bottles and change diapers and braid hair, all while talking to the baby, to the air, to his dead wife, to whoever was in the room. He talked his way through laying brick for the next 3 decades. He talked his way through Idalia's first day of kindergarten, her first communion, her quinceanera, her high school graduation, her enlistment, her boot camp graduation, her first deployment, her second, her third, her fourth, her promotion to corporal, to sergeant, to staff sergeant, to gunnery sergeant, to first sergeant. He talked at every milestone. He talked between every milestone. He talked, Beto Solis told me, the way a man drinks water in the desert. Like if he stops, he will die. And maybe he was right. Maybe that is exactly what would have happened. Maybe Lucila's death gave him a choice. Talk forever or stop forever. And he chose talk. And that choice kept him alive for 31 more years. There was exactly one moment in those 31 years, according to every person I have spoken with who knew Tomas Mercado, when he did not talk. It was the 17th of June, 2003. Idalia was 17 years old. She had graduated from Homer Hanna High School in Brownsville 3 weeks earlier. She had not told her father what she had decided to do after graduation, because she knew, in the way that children who have been raised by a single talkative parent always know, that the conversation was going to be difficult, and she had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had not come, and she had run out of waiting time. Because the bus to the Marine Corps recruiting station in McAllen was leaving the next morning at 05:30, and she had signed the enlistment papers 2 weeks before, and she needed to tell him before he found out from someone else, which in Brownsville, Texas, in 2003, was going to be a matter of hours. She told him at the kitchen table after dinner. She said, "Papa, I enlisted. Marine Corps. I leave tomorrow for MEPS. I shipped to Paris Island on the 8th of July." Tomas Mercado was, at that moment, in the middle of a sentence. The sentence was about a man he had known in the Union Hall in 1982 who had owed him $43 and had moved to Corpus Christi without paying. He stopped mid-sentence. He closed his mouth. He looked at his daughter. He opened his mouth. He closed his mouth. He opened his mouth. He did not speak. He sat at the kitchen table, with his mouth open, for, by Idalia's later account, somewhere between 30 seconds and a full minute. His sister Esperanza, who was visiting that week, was washing dishes at the sink. She told me, 20 years later, that the silence in the kitchen was the loudest sound she had heard in her entire life, and that she had stopped washing the dishes and had stood very still at the sink, with a soapy plate in her hand, because she understood that something was happening in that kitchen that she was not supposed to interrupt. Tomas closed his mouth. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the wall behind her, where, in a small wooden frame, hung the only photograph he had of Lucila, a black and white picture from their wedding day. In March of 1985, in which Lucila was wearing her mother's wedding dress and a small white flower in her hair, and was looking, not at the camera, but at Tomas, who was standing just out of frame. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not speak. Then he stood up. He walked around the table. He bent down. He kissed his daughter on the top of her head. He walked out of the kitchen, through the living room, out the front door, and onto the porch, where he sat down in the same folding aluminum lawn chair he had been sitting in for 17 years, and where he stayed, in complete silence, until well after midnight, when Adalia, who had not slept, came out and sat down on the porch step at his feet, the way she had been sitting at his feet since she was 4 years old, and waited. He did not speak that night. He did not speak the next morning, when he drove her to the bus station in his truck. He did not speak when he hugged her at the curb. He did not speak when she got on the bus. He stood on the sidewalk and watched the bus pull away, and he raised one hand, and he waved, and he did not speak. He drove home. He went to work. He laid brick that day for a man named Anselmo Ortega, who was adding a porch to his house on Old Port Isabel Road. He laid brick in silence, which Anselmo Ortega, who told me this story personally, in 2023, in his garage in Brownsville, where he is now retired, said was the strangest experience I ever had in my life. I had hired Tomas Mercado 4 or 5 times over the years, and every job he ever did for me, he talked the entire time, from sunup to sundown, about everything in the world. That day he laid brick from 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, and he did not say one word. Not one. I asked him at lunch if everything was all right. He nodded. He did not speak. I let him alone. I figured something had happened, and he would tell me when he was ready. He never told me. I found out 3 months later, from somebody else, that his daughter had joined the Marines. By then he was talking again. He never mentioned that day to me. I never mentioned it to him. He started talking again the next morning, according to his sister Esperanza, at approximately 06:15, over coffee in the kitchen, mid-sentence, as if he had simply paused for 36 hours in the middle of a thought and was now resuming. The sentence he resumed with was, according to Esperanza, and the thing about Eisenhower was that he understood logistics, which is more than I can say for most of the presidents we have had since. She did not know what the first half of the sentence had been. He never said. He talked for the next 14 years, until the morning of the 3rd of November, 2017, when he sat down in his lawn chair on the porch at 6:30 in the morning with a cup of coffee and a copy of the Brownsville Herald, and he died, mid-sentence, of a heart attack, alone, on the porch, with the cup of coffee still in his hand and the newspaper open on his lap to the sports section, which is exactly the way he had been telling people for 15 years that he wanted to go. Esperanza Mercado de Villarreal told me, on the telephone in the spring of 2022, my brother Tomas talked for 31 years and 7 months and 21 days, from the moment Lucila died to the moment he died himself. He stopped talking exactly once in all that time. He stopped for 36 hours when his daughter told him she was going to be a Marine. I have thought about that silence for 20 years. I think I have figured out what it meant. I think it meant that Tomas Mercado, who had been talking for 17 years to keep from feeling what he was feeling, looked at his daughter across the kitchen table that night and understood, all at once, that she was going to be doing the same thing he had been doing, finding a way to keep going after losing the person who held her in the world, and that he could not, with all his words, protect her from it. He could only watch her go, and the only way he knew how to honor that, in that moment, was to stop talking, just for a day and a half, just long enough to let the weight of what she was doing land on him without him talking it away. After that he could start talking again, because after that he had given her the only silence he had to give. He had given her his silence, and he had given it to her on purpose. I have thought about that for a long time. I have thought about it almost every time I sit down to tell one of these stories. The men in this country who do not know how to be quiet, and the daughters who learn to listen anyway, and the one moment, somewhere in a lifetime, when one of those men finds the silence inside himself and gives it deliberately, as a gift, to a child who is about to walk into a world that the father cannot follow her into. That is who raised Adalia Mercado, a talker who knew, exactly once, how to stop. She carried that silence with her to Paris Island on the 8th of July, 2003. She carried it through boot camp, through the School of Infantry East at Camp Geiger, through her first duty assignment with 2nd Marines at Camp Lejeune, through her first deployment to Iraq in 2005, her second to Iraq in 2007, her third to Afghanistan in 2009, and her fourth, the one we are coming to, the one in which the TOC and the lieutenant colonel and the 6 seconds happened, to Afghanistan again in 2011 with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines in Helmand Province, in a forward operating base named after a city in Scotland that nobody in the battalion had ever been to. She also carried, the entire time, the habit of listening that she had learned at her father's feet on a porch on Calle Adams. She listened. She listened in the way that only children of talkers can listen, which is the way that picks up not what is being said, but what is being avoided, not the words, but the spaces between them, not the surface, but the shape of the thing underneath the surface. She listened to her drill instructors at Paris Island, and she heard which ones were teaching her to survive and which ones were teaching her to look good. She listened to her squad leaders at Lejeune, and she heard which ones knew the terrain and which ones were reading the map upside down. She listened to her officers in Iraq, and she heard which ones were going to get people killed and which ones were going to get people home. She did not always say what she heard. She mostly did not. She was, for the first 11 years of her career, a woman who almost never spoke unless she was asked a direct question, and who, when she answered in the smallest number of words the question would tolerate. This made her a slightly unusual Marine. The Marine Corps, contrary to its public image, is not a quiet institution. The Marine Corps is, in its daily texture, an extraordinarily loud institution, full of loud people who have learned that volume is a substitute for clarity in approximately 70% of operational situations and a substitute for competence in approximately 30%. Mercado was the opposite. She was quiet in a loud corps. She was, by the assessment of every fitness report she received between 2003 and 2011, and I have read all of them, because they are in her selection board package, which is in turn part of the public record of her Sergeant Major Board, which I am authorized to discuss in general terms. An unusually deliberate Marine who speaks rarely and to the point, and whose silences, in the experience of this reporting senior, are more informative than most Marines' speech. That phrase, whose silences are more informative than most Marines' speech, appeared in 7 separate fitness reports over the course of her enlisted career, written by 7 different reporting seniors who, as far as I can tell, had never spoken to each other. 7 different officers, across 8 years in 3 countries, independently arrived at the same observation, that the most useful thing Adalia Mercado did in a room was not talk. She got promoted on schedule. She made corporal in 2005, sergeant in 2007, staff sergeant in 2009, gunnery sergeant in 2010, which was a fast pickup by Marine Corps standards, but not extraordinary. And then, in February of 2011, 6 months before the events at FOB Edinburgh that we are coming to, she was meritoriously promoted to first sergeant, 2 years below the zone, on the recommendation of her battalion commander at Lejeune, a lieutenant colonel named Marcus Tibbets, who is now retired, who lives in Wilmington, North Carolina, and who I spoke with in 2023. Tibbets told me, I promoted Mercado early because she was the best listener I had ever served with. That is not the reason you usually promote somebody to first sergeant. You usually promote them because they are loud and they can move a company. Mercado was not loud. She could move a company anyway, and I figured out why about 3 months into her time as my gunny. She moved the company by listening to it. She knew which corporals were tired, which staff sergeants were drinking too much, which lance corporals were getting bad mail from home. She knew it before they knew it, because she listened and they talked, and most of the talking she heard was the talking around the thing, not the talking about the thing. She would walk up to a Marine 3 days before that Marine's marriage fell apart, and she would put her hand on his shoulder and she would say, "Take the weekend, Devereaux. I've got your duty." And Devereaux would look at her like she had read his mail. And she had not read his mail. She had read his face, which Devereaux himself had not yet read. That is the kind of first sergeant you want when you deploy. That is the kind of first sergeant I wanted to take to Afghanistan. So I promoted her early, and I sent her there. And she got on the plane in May of 2011 with Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, and I did not see her again for 7 months, by which point what had happened in the TOC had happened, and she was no longer my gunny or my first sergeant or anybody's anything, except in the sense that she was now, very clearly, on her way to being something that the Marine Corps does not produce more than 2 or 3 of in any given decade. I do not regret promoting her. I regret only that I did not promote her earlier. That was Tibbetts in 2023. Mercado was, by then, a sergeant major with 2 stars on her chevrons, serving as sergeant major of an infantry regiment at Camp Pendleton. She had not yet been selected for sergeant major of the Marine Corps. That selection was still 2 years away. The selection board that would put her name on the list, with Brennan's 9-word endorsement in the package, was still 2 years away. But all of that is the back half of the story. We are still in the front half. We are still moving toward the TOC. I want to tell you about FOB Edinburgh and about Bravo Company's area of operations in the southern Helmand River Valley, and about Lieutenant Colonel Walker Brennan, and about how Mercado came to be standing in a CAS briefing at 0347 local on the 12th of August, 2011, with the right grid coordinates in her head and the wrong grid coordinates on the strike package board and the lapels of a battalion commander about to be in her hands. We are going to take this slow. The TOC will wait. It has waited 11 years. Forward Operating Base Edinburgh sat in the central Helmand River Valley, approximately 15 kilometers north of the district center of Nowzad, in what was, in the summer of 2011, the most kinetic battle space in the entire ISAF area of responsibility. 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, call sign Beach, had relieved 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines at Edinburgh in mid-May of 2011, in the standard 7-month rotation cycle that the Marine Corps was running through Helmand at that point in the war. The battalion had 4 rifle companies, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Weapons, spread across a constellation of patrol bases and combat outposts in a roughly 40 square kilometer area of operations that included the villages of Karamanda, Yadamche, and a small cluster of mud-walled compounds along the eastern bank of the Helmand River that the maps called Dehanak and the locals called nothing in particular, because the village had been abandoned and reoccupied so many times in the previous 9 years that the people who lived there had stopped giving it a name out loud. The terrain was the terrain that the Marine Corps had been fighting in for 2 years by then and would fight in for 2 more years after that. Irrigated farmland, intersected by a grid of waist-deep canals called wadis, dotted with mud brick compounds whose walls were 18 inches thick and which functioned, from a tactical standpoint, as small forts. The compounds were occupied by farmers' families, by Taliban fighters, by farmers who were also Taliban fighters, by farmers who were not Taliban fighters, but whose brothers were, by farmers whose brothers had been killed by Taliban fighters, and by farmers who had no opinion about the Taliban at all, and just wanted to grow opium poppies and pomegranates and be left alone, in approximately that order of frequency. The job of 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, in that summer, was to determine which compound contained which kind of farmer, and to do so without killing the wrong farmer, which was, to put it mildly, not a job that the Marine Corps had been organizationally designed to do. Bravo Company, under the command of Captain Russell Hartigan, a 31-year-old Naval Academy graduate out of Sacramento, California, on his second deployment, who I have spoken with at length, and who is now a lieutenant colonel teaching at the Marine Corps War College in Quantico, was responsible for the southern third of the battalion area, which included the village of Dehannock and the surrounding farmland on the eastern bank of the river. Bravo Company had 2 combat outposts forward of FOB Edinburgh, Combat Outpost Hanson, on a low ridge 2 kilometers east of Dehannock, and Patrol Base Fulford, in the village of Yadamche, for kilometers to the north, and 1 platoon, 3rd Platoon, that operated in a rotating cycle of 72-hour patrols out of Hanson, sweeping the canal network and the compound clusters on the eastern bank for weapons caches, command wire, and the men who were emplacing both. 3rd Platoon was led, in August of 2011, by a first lieutenant named Wendell Croft, out of Bozeman, Montana, 24 years old, 3 months into his first deployment, on his 4th platoon-level operation as platoon commander. Croft had been a Naval Academy lacrosse player, had commissioned in 2009, had completed the basic school and the infantry officer course at Quantico in 2010, and had joined 1st Battalion, 8th Marines in January of 2011, which gave him approximately 4 months of garrison time at Lejeune before the battalion deployed. He was, by every account I have been able to gather, a brave and competent young officer who was learning fast. He was also, by his own admission to me in a long telephone conversation in 2023, the kind of platoon commander who would have gotten a lot of Marines killed in my first 6 months over there if I had not had Adalia Mercado standing 6 feet behind me at every single key decision point, not saying anything, just standing there, so that when I was about to do something stupid, I could feel her not saying anything, and I would stop, and I would think it through again, and I would make a different decision. She never told me I was wrong. She just stood there, and she let me figure out that I was wrong by the quality of her silence. I have never met another senior enlisted Marine who could do that. I do not expect to meet one again. That was Mercado's role in Bravo Company in the summer of 2011. She was the company first sergeant, which meant on paper that she was responsible for the welfare, discipline, and administrative readiness of all 143 Marines and corpsmen assigned to the company. In practice, because Hartigan trusted her, and because Croft was on his first deployment, and because the company's other 2 platoon commanders were also lieutenants on their first deployments, Mercado spent the majority of her time forward, out of the wire, at Combat Outpost Hanson and Patrol Base Fulford, embedded with the platoons, standing 6 feet behind whichever lieutenant was about to make a decision, and letting her silence do the work that her words would have done if she had been a different kind of first sergeant. She had been doing this for 91 days by the morning of the 12th of August. She had not lost a Marine. Bravo Company, in fact, had not lost a Marine since taking over the AO in mid-May, which was, in the summer of 2011, in that part of Helmand, statistically remarkable. The battalion's other 3 rifle companies had collectively lost 11 Marines killed and 31 wounded in the same 91-day window. Bravo Company had lost 0 killed and 4 wounded, all 4 of whom had returned to duty within 72 hours. Captain Hartigan, in a written endorsement he submitted to the battalion commander on the 30th of July, 11 days before the events in the TOC, attributed this directly to the operational judgment of First Sergeant Mercado, whose presence forward with the platoons has, in my professional opinion, prevented at least 3 engagements that would have resulted in friendly casualties. and whose ability to read the human terrain of this AO exceeds that of any officer in my command, including myself. That endorsement is also in her selection board package. Brennan had read it. Brennan had initialed it. Brennan had filed it. Brennan had, by his own later admission to me, paid almost no attention to it at the time because Brennan, in late July of 2011, was a lieutenant colonel with 3 rifle companies that were taking casualties and 1 rifle company that was not. And the rifle company that was not was, in Brennan's mental ledger, the one he did not have to think about, which is exactly the wrong way for a battalion commander to think about a rifle company, in which Brennan would later identify. In a long and remarkably honest interview he gave me in 2022 on the back porch of his house in Pensacola, Florida, as the single largest professional mistake of my 27-year career, and the reason I almost killed 31 of her Marines on the 12th of August. Let me tell you about Walker Brennan. Walker Hollis Brennan was born on the 4th of February, 1968, in Mobile, Alabama, the second of 3 sons of a Methodist minister named Hollis Brennan and a high school English teacher named Margaret Brennan, née Pettigrew. He grew up in a 2-story wood-frame parsonage on Government Street, 3 blocks from the church his father preached in for 31 years, in a neighborhood of live oaks and Spanish moss and the slow brown gravity of the Gulf Coast in the 1970s. He was, by every account I have been able to gather, an unremarkable child in an unremarkable family in an unremarkable southern city, with one exception, which was that from the age of approximately 7 he wanted, with a clarity that his parents found alternately admirable and alarming, to be a United States Marine. His father, the minister, was a Korean War veteran who had served 2 years in the Army as an enlisted infantryman in 1952 and 1953, had been wounded at a place he refused to name to anyone, including his wife, had come home, had gone to seminary on the GI Bill, had married Margaret Pettigrew in 1964, and had spent the next 4 decades preaching the gospel of a forgiving God to a congregation of Methodists who, in his private opinion, did not need to be forgiven nearly as much as they thought they did. He did not encourage his son's interest in the military. He did not discourage it either. He did, on exactly one occasion, when Walker was 15 years old, sit his son down on the front porch of the parsonage on a summer evening in 1983 and say to him, in the careful Methodist cadence he used for his Sunday sermons, "Son, if you are going to do this thing, do it for the right reasons. Do not do it because you want to be a hero. Heroes get other people killed. Do it because you want to take care of the men they give you. That is the only reason to do it. If you cannot do it for that reason, do something else." Brennan told me this story in 2022 on the back porch of his house in Pensacola, with 2 glasses of iced tea between us and a yellow Labrador asleep at his feet. And he told me that he had thought about that conversation, his father's exact words, approximately once a week for 40 years, and that he had failed to live up to them, in his own judgment, on exactly one occasion in his entire career, and that the occasion had been the 12th of August, 2011, in the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Edinburgh, when a first sergeant whose name he did not at that moment remember had told him that his strike package coordinates were wrong, and he had called her daughter and told her to sit down. And he had almost killed 31 Marines because he was tired, and because he had been the battalion commander for 9 months, and because he had stopped listening to anyone whose voice did not carry the weight of rank he understood. But I am getting ahead of myself again. Let me stay with Brennan in Mobile for a moment longer, because I want you to understand who walked into the TOC that morning. I want you to understand that he was not a bad officer. I want you to understand that he was a good officer on most days, in most circumstances, by most measures the Marine Corps uses to measure such things, and that what almost happened in the TOC that morning was not the failure of a bad man. It was the failure of a good man who had been doing a hard job for a long time and had forgotten one of the things his father had told him on a porch in Mobile when he was 15 years old. The failure of a good man is, in my experience, the more dangerous failure, because a bad man's failure is visible from a long way off, and you can prepare for it. A good man's failure arrives wearing the uniform of his goodness, and you do not see it coming until it is 6 inches from your face and calling you daughter. Brennan graduated from Murphy High School in Mobile in 1986. He was accepted to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis on the appointment of his congressman, a man named Sonny Callahan, who had served with Brennan's uncle in the Air Force in the 1960s and who, according to Brennan's older brother Edmund, a retired insurance underwriter who still lives in Mobile and who I spoke with by telephone in 2023, owed our family approximately one favor, and he repaid it by sending Walker to Annapolis, which my father was not entirely happy about, because my father had served in the Army and considered the Navy to be, in his exact words, the branch for men who want to fight a war without sleeping in the dirt. But my father did not object out loud, because my father did not object to anything out loud. Brennan graduated from Annapolis in 1990, was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, completed the basic school at Quantico in the spring of 1991, and reported to his first duty assignment, 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines at Camp Lejeune, in June of that year, approximately 90 days after the conclusion of the ground war in Kuwait, which he had missed by a margin of weeks and which would, by his own admission, follow me for the rest of my career as a young officer, because every captain and major I served under in the 90s had been there, and I had not, and there was nothing I could do about it except work harder than the men who had, which is what I tried to do, and which is, I think now, the thing that made me into the officer I became, for better and for worse. He deployed to Somalia in 1993 as a first lieutenant attached to the Joint Task Force in support of Operation Restore Hope. He was not in Mogadishu during the events of October 3rd and 4th. He was, in fact, on a ship in the Indian Ocean, 200 miles from the coast, on Liberty rotation, but he flew into Mogadishu on the 8th of October as part of the augmentation force. And he stood on the airfield at 0700 the next morning and watched for C-130s land carrying the bodies of the men who had died at the Becerra market. And he told me, 30 years later, on a porch in Pensacola, that the sound of the loading ramps coming down on those C-130s was the sound that had taught him what command actually meant. He was promoted to captain in 1995 and commanded a rifle company in 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines from 1996 to 1998. He was promoted to major in 2000 and served as a battalion operations officer in 2nd Marines during the early phases of the war in Afghanistan, deploying to Kandahar in 2002. He commanded a battalion staff in Iraq in 2004 during the First Battle of Fallujah and returned to Iraq in 2006 for the long 13-month deployment that broke the careers of approximately 1 in 3 Marine field-grade officers who undertook it. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 2007. He served 2 years on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon, which he hated and which he later told me was the closest I ever came in my career to resigning my commission, because the Joint Staff is where good infantry officers go to forget what they learned from their men, and I could feel it happening to me in real time. He requested battalion command at the end of his Pentagon tour, was selected on his first look, and was given 1st Battalion, 8th Marines in November of 2010. The battalion deployed to Helmand 7 months later, in May of 2011. By the morning of the 12th of August, he had been a battalion commander in combat for 92 days. He had lost 11 Marines killed in action and 31 wounded, all from Alpha, Charlie, and weapons companies. He had written 11 letters to 11 sets of parents. He had attended 6 ramp ceremonies on the flight line at Camp Bastion. He had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours since the 3rd of June. He was 43 years old, and he was, by his own later description to me, the most tired I have ever been in my life, before or since, including the time my wife was dying. His wife was not dying in 2011. His wife, a woman named Patricia Brennan, née Halliburton, would not be diagnosed with the pancreatic cancer that eventually killed her until 2017. But Brennan, when he described to me his exhaustion on the morning of the 12th of August, 2011, used his wife's death as the comparison point, which I think tells you something about what it meant to be commanding an infantry battalion in Helmand in that summer. The men who did it have, ever since, used the worst experiences of the rest of their lives as the comparison points for what those 7 months felt like, and the comparisons usually run in the direction of the deployment having been worse. He was tired. He was, on the morning of the 12th of August, 2011, at 0347 local, sitting in the Tactical Operations Center at FOB Edinburgh, reviewing a close air support strike package for a deliberate strike on a compound in the village of Dehannock on the eastern bank of the Helmand River, which is S2. His battalion intelligence officer, a captain named Devin Pruitt, out of Ohio, on his second deployment, had assessed, with high confidence, to contain a Taliban command. So responsible for the emplacement of 3 of the improvised explosive devices that had killed 3 of his Marines in late July. The strike package had been generated by the Joint Terminal Attack Controller assigned to the battalion, an Air Force Staff Sergeant named Kyler Voss, who had transcribed the grid coordinates from Pruitt's intelligence summary onto the acetate-covered briefing board in the TOC at approximately 0335, 12 minutes before Brennan walked in. The coordinates Voss had written on the board were 41 SMR 8760 335 21. The coordinates in Pruitt's intelligence summary were 41 SMR 8760 345 21. The difference was 1 digit. The 4th digit of the northing, a 3 instead of a 4. 1 kilometer south of where the target compound actually was. 1 kilometer south of where the target compound actually was, in the village of Dehannock, in the early hours of the 12th of August, 2011, was the position of 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, 31 Marines under the command of 1st Lieutenant Wendell Croft and the supervision of 1st Sergeant Idalia Mercado, who had moved into a defensive perimeter at that grid square at approximately 2200 the previous evening, who had reported. The position to the company command post at 2215, who had reported it again to the battalion COC at 2230, and whose position was, at the moment Brennan sat down in the TOC, marked in grease pencil on the friendly forces overlay that was hanging on the wall directly behind the strike package briefing board, in plain view of every officer in the room, including Captain Pruitt, including Staff Sergeant Voss, including Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, and including 1st Sergeant Mercado, who was the only person in the room who, in the next 90 seconds, was going to look at both boards. She was in the TOC because Captain Hartigan had asked her to be. Hartigan was at Combat Outpost Hanson with 1st Platoon, for kilometers east of FOB Edinburgh, and he had wanted Bravo Company represented at the strike brief, because the target compound was in Bravo's AO, and because Hartigan, like every good company commander, did not like ordnance falling in his AO without somebody from his company watching it happen. Mercado had ridden in on a logistics convoy at 2330 the previous night, had slept for 2 hours on a cot in the rear of the COC, had drunk a cup of instant coffee at 0315, and had walked into the TOC at 0342, 5 minutes before Brennan. In her dusty utilities with her name tape reading Mercado, and her rank insignia of first sergeant on her collar, and her hair in the regulation bun that she had been wearing under her helmet for 9 consecutive days. She had taken a position at the back of the TOC, against the plywood wall, behind the row of folding chairs in which the officers were seated. She had not sat down. She did not, as a general matter, sit down in rooms full of officers. She stood. She listened. She watched. There were 14 officers in the TOC. Brennan, the battalion commander. Major Elliot Hargrove, the battalion executive officer, out of Richmond, Virginia. Major Sutter Banks, the battalion operations officer, out of Tucson. Captain Pruitt, the intelligence officer. Captain Lemuel Aiken, the air officer, out of Mobile, which Brennan had noted with private amusement on the day Aiken had reported to the battalion, because 2 officers from the same town in Alabama in the same battalion staff was, by Brennan's estimation, statistically unlikely and possibly an act of God. Captain Doreen Wexler, the fires officer, out of San Diego, the only female officer on the battalion staff, who had been with the battalion for 14 months and who had, in Brennan's private assessment, the best tactical mind of anyone on my staff, including me. 2 lieutenants from the operations section, 3 NCOs from the COC, Staff Sergeant Voss the JTAC, and Mercado against the back wall. 14 officers, 1 first sergeant, 1 JTAC, 1 wrong grid coordinate on the strike package board, 1 correct grid coordinate on the friendly forces overlay, 6 feet to the right of the strike package board, where her platoon was marked in grease pencil. Brennan sat down. He had a cup of coffee in his left hand. He had a copy of Pruitt's intelligence summary in his right hand. He set the coffee down on the small folding table in front of him. He set the summary down next to the coffee. He looked at the briefing board. He looked at Voss. He said, "Walk me through it, Staff Sergeant." Voss walked him through it. Voss was a competent JTAC. Voss had been in country for 5 months. Voss had run 41 strike packages in those 5 months and had not, to his own knowledge, ever transcribed a grid coordinate wrong. He had transcribed this one wrong because he had been awake for 19 hours and had been working off a printed copy of Pruitt's summary in which the 4th digit of the northing had been smudged slightly by the toner of the company printer at the COC in a way that made the 4 look, in the red light of the TOC at 03:30 in the morning, like a 3. Voss had transcribed what he saw. What he saw was a 3. What was actually printed was a 4. The difference was the width of a human hair on a sheet of printer paper at 3:30 in the morning, and the difference was 1 kilometer on the ground, and the difference was 31 Marines. He walked Brennan through the strike package. Target compound. 2 structures. Estimated 4 to 6 personnel inside. Squirter possibility to the north. 1 500-pound GB-38 JDM delivered by an F/18 on station out of Kandahar. Time on target 0405. Collateral damage estimate low. Civilian casualty estimate 0. Friendly forces none within 1 kilometer. That last line was the line that mattered. Friendly forces none within 1 kilometer. Voss said it because the coordinates on his board put the target 1 kilometer south of where the target actually was, which put it almost exactly on top of 3rd Platoon's position, which put it within 0 kilometers of friendly forces, not 1. But Voss did not know that, because Voss was looking at his board and not at the friendly forces overlay 6 feet to his right, and Pruitt did not know that, because Pruitt had written the summary and was now listening to it being read back and was not, in the way that intelligence officers often are not, looking at the friendly forces overlay either. Brennan did not know it because Brennan had not yet looked at the friendly forces overlay. Brennan was looking at Voss. Brennan was nodding. Brennan was tired. Mercado looked at the strike package board. Mercado looked at the friendly forces overlay. Mercado looked at the strike package board again. She did the math in her head. She had walked her platoon into that grid square 9 hours earlier. She knew the grid square the way a woman knows the layout of her own kitchen in the dark. The grid square was 41 SMR 8760 34521. The strike package board said 41 SMR 8760 33521. The difference was one digit. The difference was 1 kilometer. The difference was her platoon. She did not speak immediately. She stood at the back of the TOC, against the plywood wall, and she did what she had been doing for 26 years of her life, which was listen. She listened to Voss finish the briefing. She listened to Pruitt confirm the target package. She listened to Captain Aiken, the air officer, confirm the F/A-18 on station and the time on target. She listened to Brennan, the battalion commander, say, in the flat, tired voice of a man who had approved 43 strike packages in 92 days and had stopped, somewhere around the 20th, expecting any of them to surprise him, confirmed. Cleared hot at 0405. That was the moment. That was the moment she stepped off the back wall. That was the moment she said, in a voice that was, by the later recollection of every officer in the TOC, not loud, not aggressive, not nervous, but perfectly calm and perfectly clear, sir. The coordinates on the strike package read 3521. They should read 4521. My platoon is at 4521. Brennan did not look up. Brennan was, at that moment, signing the back of the strike package authorization form with a black ballpoint pen that the COC kept in a coffee mug on the corner of the briefing table. Brennan was tired. Brennan had been a battalion commander in combat for 92 days. Brennan had heard, in those 92 days, approximately 300 interruptions from approximately 100 different staff officers and NCOs, of which approximately 290 had been wrong or unimportant or both. Brennan had developed, in those 92 days, an organizational reflex that the human brain develops in any environment of high cognitive load, which is the reflex to filter out interruptions before processing them. The reflex is efficient. The reflex is necessary. The reflex is also, occasionally, fatal. Brennan did not look up. Brennan said, in the same flat, tired voice he had used to clear the strike, without lifting his eyes from the authorization form, without registering the rank or the gender or the identity of the person who had spoken, "Sit down, daughter. The big boys are talking." The TOC went quiet. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a thing has been said that everyone in the room understands cannot be unsaid, and that everyone in the room is now, in the next 2 or 3 seconds, going to have to figure out how to respond to. Captain Wexler, the fires officer, the only other woman in the room, looked up from her notebook. Major Hargrove, the executive officer, looked up from his coffee. Captain Pruitt, the intelligence officer, looked at Brennan. Staff Sergeant Voss looked at the floor. The 2 lieutenants from the operations section looked at each other. The 3 NCOs from the COC looked at the wall. Nobody looked at Mercado. Mercado looked at Brennan. She did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not, in any visible way, register what had just been said. She stood at the back of the TOC, against the plywood wall, with her hands at her sides, and she said, in the same calm, clear voice she had used the first time, "Sir, the coordinates are wrong. My platoon is in that grid square. You need to look at the friendly forces overlay." Brennan looked up. He looked up because something in the second sentence had penetrated the reflex. Something in the words friendly forces overlay had landed in the part of his brain that was still, beneath the exhaustion and the reflex and the 92 days, the part of his brain that his father on a porch in Mobile in 1983 had told him to protect. The part that knew what command actually meant. The part that had stood on an airfield in Mogadishu in 1993 and watched the ramps come down. He looked up. He saw her. He saw, for the first time that morning, a first sergeant standing at the back of his TOC, in dusty utilities, with her name tape reading Mercado and her rank insignia of first sergeant on her collar and her hair in a regulation bun, looking at him with an expression that was not angry, was not frightened, was not insubordinate, but was simply, completely, unmistakably correct. He should have stood up. He should have walked to the friendly forces overlay. He should have looked. He did not. Instead, he made the second mistake. The first mistake had been the reflex, the sit-down daughter, which was forgivable, which was the mistake of a tired man in the wrong moment. The second mistake was the mistake of a man who had heard his own voice say something he was now embarrassed by, and who, in the small ugly chemistry that happens in the brain of an embarrassed man in front of his subordinates, decided to double down on the wrongness rather than admit it, because admitting it in front of 14 officers was, in that small ugly chemistry, more frightening than the possibility of being wrong about the coordinates. Brennan looked at her. Brennan said, in a voice that was now slightly louder than the first time, slightly harder, slightly more deliberately the voice of a lieutenant colonel speaking to a first sergeant. First sergeant, I gave you an order. Sit down. There were no chairs at the back of the TOC. There was nowhere for her to sit. The order was not really an order to sit. The order was an order to be quiet. The order was an order to accept that the rank on his collar outweighed the knowledge in her head, and to allow the strike to proceed, and to discover, in approximately 18 minutes, when the smoke cleared over the wrong grid square, what the cost of that acceptance had been. She did not sit. She did not have anywhere to sit. She also, as became clear in the next 4 seconds, did not have any intention of being quiet. She took one step forward, then another, then another. She walked the length of the TOC, from the back wall to the briefing table, past the row of folding chairs in which the 14 officers were sitting, past Captain Wexler, who watched her go with an expression that Wexler later described to me as the expression of a woman watching another woman do something that she herself had wanted to do for 14 months and had not had the courage to do. Past Major Hargrove, who half stood from his chair and then sat back down because he did not know what to do. Past Captain Pruitt, who had begun, in the previous 2 seconds, to look at the friendly forces overlay on the wall and to understand, in the slow horror of a man recognizing his own error, what was about to happen. She walked to the front of the TOC. She walked around the briefing table. She stopped in front of Brennan. She reached out with both hands. She took 2 fistfuls of his Marpat collar, and she pulled him, gently, but with the full weight of her body behind it, 6 inches forward, until his face was 6 inches from hers, and the briefing board with the wrong coordinates was directly in his peripheral vision on his left, and the friendly forces overlay with the correct coordinates was directly in his peripheral vision on his right. And she said, in a voice that was, by every later recollection, not a shout, not a whisper, but the exact pitch and volume of a woman speaking to her father across a kitchen table, sir. With respect, read the grid. My Marines are in that square. And then nobody in the TOC moved. For 6 seconds. 6 seconds. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because it does not sound like a long time when you say it out loud. 6 seconds is the time it takes to tie a shoelace. 6 seconds is the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee. 6 seconds is, in the ordinary unfolding of an ordinary day, the smallest unit of time at which anything important ever happens. In a tactical operations center in Helmand Province at 0348 local on the 12th of August, 2011, 6 seconds was the time it took for 14 United States Marine Corps officers and 1 Air Force Joint Terminal Attack Controller to understand, individually and collectively, that the first sergeant of Bravo Company had just committed assault upon a field-grade officer in the conduct of his duties, and that the field-grade officer was about to either court-martial her, relieve her, strike her, or read the friendly forces overlay. The first second, nobody moved. The second, Captain Wexler, the fire's officer, set down her pen. The pen was a black Skillcraft government-issue ballpoint, and it made a small click on the folding table in front of her that, in the absolute silence of the TOC, every person in the room heard. Wexler told me, in a long conversation in 2023 in a coffee shop in Coronado, California, where she now works as a civilian contractor for the Navy, that she set the pen down deliberately. "I set the pen down," she said, "because I wanted my hands free. I did not know what was going to happen in the next 10 seconds. I thought it might be necessary for me, as the only other female officer in the room, to do something. I did not know what. I just knew that my hands needed to be free. So I put the pen down." The third second, Major Hargrove, the executive officer, half rose from his chair. Hargrove was a tall man, 6'3", 220 pounds, a former college wrestler at Virginia Military Institute, the kind of officer whose physical presence in a room tended to settle disputes before they were spoken aloud. He half rose because he saw, in the third second, what every other officer in the room was about to see, which was that the first sergeant who had her hands on the battalion commander was not letting go, and that the battalion commander, whose own hands were now hovering in the space between his lap and her wrists, had not yet decided what to do about it. Hargrove was preparing, in the third second, to physically intervene. He told me, in 2023, by telephone from his home in Richmond, where he now sells commercial real estate. I was about to grab her. I had decided. I was going to grab her by the back of her flack and pull her off him, and I was going to put her on the ground if I had to, because that was what I thought the situation required. I was 3/4 of the way out of my chair when Brennan looked at the map, and I stopped, and I sat back down, because I understood, in that instant, that the situation had just become something else entirely, and that whatever I had been about to do was the wrong thing. The fourth second, Brennan looked at the map. He did not turn his head. He did not need to. The friendly forces overlay was in his peripheral vision on his right, and the strike package board was in his peripheral vision on his left, and Mercado's face was directly in front of him, 6 inches away, and her 2 fistfuls of his Marpat collar were directly under his chin, and her eyes were locked onto his, and her eyes were not asking him to look at the map. Her eyes were telling him that he was going to look at the map. Her eyes were, in the words Brennan himself used to me on the back porch in Pensacola 11 years later, the eyes of a woman who had already decided that I was either going to look at the map or I was going to have to break her wrists to make her let go, and that either outcome was acceptable to her, because either outcome resulted in the strike being held. He looked at the map. He looked first at the friendly forces overlay, on his right. He saw the grease pencil mark for 3rd Platoon's position. He saw the 4-digit grid that he had not bothered to check, because he had not bothered to think about Bravo Company in 3 weeks, because Bravo Company was the company he did not have to think about. He saw 41 SMR 8760 34521. He looked at the strike package board on his left. He saw the 4-digit grid that Voss had transcribed. He saw 41 SMR 8760 33521. He saw the difference. He saw it the way a man sees, in a single instant, the kind of mistake that ends careers and ends lives. And he saw, in the same instant, that the mistake had not yet ended either, because a first sergeant out of Brownsville, Texas, was holding him by the collar and giving him the chance to undo it. The 5th second, Brennan let go of the chair he had been gripping with his right hand. He had been gripping it, Wexler later told me, hard enough that his knuckles were white. He let go. He raised his right hand, slowly, palm open, and he placed it, gently, on Mercado's right wrist. He did not pull. He did not push. He just placed it there. And he said, in a voice that was, by every account, the voice of a man who had returned to himself, "Stand down, First Sergeant." I see it. The 6th second, Mercado let go of his collar. She did not step back. She did not look away. She straightened the front of his uniform with 2 short downward tugs, the way a woman straightens her father's tie before he walks into a church. She took 1 step back. She said, "Roger that, sir." And then Brennan stood up, and he turned to Staff Sergeant Voss, and he said, in the same returned voice, calm now, fully present, the voice of the officer his father in Mobile in 1983 had told him to be, "Abort. Abort the strike. Get the pilot on the net. Abort." Voss aborted the strike. The F/A-18, which was, at that moment, approximately 17 minutes from time on target and approximately 11 minutes from weapons release, broke off, climbed, and held in an orbit at Angels 22 while the TOC re-verified the coordinates. Pruitt pulled the original intelligence summary, the unsmudged copy, from the file box on his desk. The 4th digit of the northing was a 4. It had always been a 4. The smudge on the printed copy in Voss's hand had been the smudge of a worn toner cartridge on a battalion printer in a plywood building in Helmand Province at 3:30 in the morning. The strike package was reissued at 0419 with the corrected coordinates. The F/A-18 rolled in at 0431. The 500-pound JDM landed at 0432 and 17 seconds in the correct grid square on the correct compound, killing, according to the post-strike assessment conducted by 3rd Platoon at first light the following morning, for individuals subsequently identified by biometric exploitation as members of the Taliban command cell that Pruitt had targeted, and damaging no friendly structures, no civilian structures, and no friendly personnel. 3rd Platoon, in the grid square 1 kilometer south of the target, heard the JDM impact at 0432 and 17 seconds. Lieutenant Croft, who was awake and on watch at the eastern corner of the perimeter, looked up at the flash, and he keyed his radio, and he called the company command post, and he said, "Bravo 6, this is Bravo 3. JDM impact, north of my position, approximately 1 click. We are all accounted for. Over." He did not know, at 0432 and 17 seconds, that the JDM had been 1 digit and approximately 23 minutes of his first sergeant's life from landing on top of him and his 30 Marines. He would not know it for another 4 days, when Mercado returned to Combat Outpost Hansen, sat down on a sandbag next to him at sunset with 2 cups of instant coffee, handed him one, and told him exactly what had happened in the TOC, in the same calm, clear voice she had used to tell Brennan to read the grid, and without any apparent emotion of any kind. Croft told me, 12 years later, she did not tell me to thank her. She did not tell me what she had done. She told me what had happened. She used the word we. We caught it. We held the strike. We reissued the coordinates. She did not use the word I once. I remember that very specifically because I sat there with the coffee getting cold in my hand and I thought, this woman just saved my entire platoon and she is sitting here telling me about it like she is reading the weather report. And I started to thank her, and she stopped me. She put her hand on my arm and she said, "Lieutenant, don't. We don't do that here." And we drank the coffee, and the sun went down, and we did not talk about it again, ever, for the rest of the deployment, for the rest of my career. I have not spoken about it to another human being, except my wife, until this phone call right now. That is what happened in the TOC at 0348 on the 12th of August, 2011. 6 seconds, 31 Marines. one collar, one grid square, one woman from Brownsville, Texas, whose father had taught her, by talking for 31 years and by being silent for 36 hours, how to listen to a room and how to know, with the kind of certainty that does not require permission, when the listening was over and the speaking had to start. Now, now I want to tell you what Brennan did the next morning. Because the 6 seconds in the TOC are the part of the story that people remember, if they remember any of it at all. And I have heard versions of those 6 seconds circulating in the senior enlisted community of the Marine Corps for more than a decade now, in various states of accuracy and various states of embellishment. But the 6 seconds are not, in my judgment, the most important part of this story. The 6 seconds are the visible part. The 6 seconds are the part you can describe in a sentence and put in a thumbnail and use to stop the scroll on a phone screen. The most important part of this story is what happened in a tent at 05:47 the next morning, when Lieutenant Colonel Walker Brennan walked alone, without his executive officer, without his sergeant major, without any witness of any kind, into First Sergeant Mercado's transient billeting tent on the western side of FOB Edinburgh, with a single sheet of paper in his hand and a single decision in his head, and did the thing that he would later describe to me as the only act of my entire 27-year career that I am absolutely certain I got right. She had not slept. She had returned to her tent at approximately 04:45, after the strike had been reissued and the F/18 had departed station and the TC had returned to its normal nightly rhythm. She had not been court-martialed. She had not been arrested. She had not been spoken to by Brennan or by Hargrove or by anyone else in the TOC after the moment she had said "Roger that, sir," and stepped back. She had simply walked out of the TOC, across the gravel walkway between the COC and the transient tents, into her tent, sat down on her cot, and waited. She waited for an hour. She did not know what she was waiting for. She did not, by her own later account to me. And I want to be clear that I have not interviewed Sergeant Major Mercado directly for this story, because she does not give interviews, and I respect that. But I have spoken with 3 people in whom she has, over the years, confided pieces of what happened, and one of them, with her permission, has shared with me her recollection of that morning in considerable detail. She did not, by her own later account, expect to be promoted. She expected to be relieved. She expected to be flown out of country on the next available rotator and processed for either administrative separation or court-martial. And she had begun, in the hour she sat on the cot, to mentally compose the letter she would write to her father in Brownsville, Texas, explaining what she had done and why she had done it and why she did not regret it. She was 3 sentences into that letter, in her head, when she heard the boots on the gravel outside the tent flap. She knew the boots. Every first sergeant in a deployed infantry battalion knows the sound of the battalion commander's boots on gravel, the same way every wife knows the sound of her husband's car in the driveway. The boots stopped outside the tent. There was a pause, then a knock on the wooden frame of the tent door, 3 raps, the way an officer knocks on the door of an enlisted Marine's quarters. She stood up. She said, "Enter." Brennan came in. He was alone. He was carrying a single sheet of paper, folded once, in his left hand. He was not wearing his cover. His face was the face of a man who had not slept either, but it was also, by her later account to her confidant, the face of a man who had decided something and had come to deliver it, and who was not interested in any discussion of the decision. He did not sit down. There was nowhere to sit except the cot, and he did not sit on her cot. He stood in the middle of the small tent, with the canvas walls breathing in the early morning desert wind, and he said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "First Sergeant, I owe you an apology." She said nothing. He said, "I called you daughter. That was wrong. I told you to sit down when you were trying to tell me my coordinates were wrong. That was worse. I almost killed 31 of your Marines because I was tired and I was not listening. I have been a battalion commander for 9 months, and I have stopped listening to anyone whose voice does not have the rank weight I am used to hearing. That is a failure of command. The failure is mine, not yours. Not anyone else's in that TOC. Mine. She said nothing. He said, I am not going to relieve you. I am not going to write you up. The UCMJ has a number of articles you could be charged under for what you did this morning, and I want you to know that I have considered all of them, and I have decided that none of them apply, because the action you took was the action that my own orders to my staff have demanded for 9 months. That any Marine in this battalion who sees something wrong in a strike package is to stop the strike package by any means necessary, before the ordnance leaves the rail. You followed my orders. The fact that the person you had to stop was me is, in the matter of those orders, immaterial. Do you understand what I am telling you? She said, Yes, sir. He said, Good. And then he unfolded the sheet of paper in his left hand, and he held it out to her, and he said, This is a meritorious promotion package. I am putting you up for sergeant major. Effective immediately. I am waiving the time in grade prerequisite by battalion commander's authority under Meridman 307/10. The package will be in front of the regimental commander by this afternoon. I expect it to be approved within 72 hours. You will be sergeant major of 1st Battalion, 8th Marines by the end of this week. Do you accept the promotion? She looked at the paper. She looked at him. She did not take the paper. She said, Sir, with respect, I did not do what I did this morning to get promoted. I did it because my Marines were in that square. He said, First Sergeant, I am aware of why you did it. I am promoting you because of who you are, which is the person who did it. Those are not the same thing. The fact that you do not understand why they are not the same thing is one of the reasons I am promoting you. Do you accept the promotion? She took the paper. She read it. It was 1 page, single-spaced, in the dense bureaucratic prose of a Marine Corps meritorious promotion endorsement. Her name, her service number, her current grade, her proposed grade, the justification which Brennan had written, by hand, on a yellow legal pad in his quarters between 04:45 and 05:30 that morning, and which his clerk had typed up at 05:35. The justification was 4 sentences long. I have read that endorsement. It is in her selection board package, which, as I have said, I am authorized to discuss in general terms. The 4 sentences read as follows. On 12 August 2011, First Sergeant Mercado identified a critical error in a close air support strike package that, if executed, would have resulted in the deaths of 31 Marines under her supervision. She communicated this error to me, the battalion commander, with the directness and physical urgency the situation demanded. Her actions saved the lives of those Marines. I recommend her promotion to E9 without further delay, and I attest that her performance on this date represents the standard of judgment, courage, and command presence that the grade of sergeant major exists to recognize. That was the endorsement. For sentences, no mention of the collar, no mention of the word daughter, no mention of the 6 seconds, no mention of anything that could be used in a subsequent administrative review as the basis for either a reprimand of her or a reprimand of him. Just the operational fact, the operational consequence, and the operational judgment. She signed it. She handed it back to him. He folded it. He put it back in his pocket. He said, Thank you, Sergeant Major. She said, Yes, sir. He turned to leave. At the tent flap, he stopped. He did not turn around. He said, First Sergeant. One more thing. She said, Sir. He said, I had a daughter. She would have been 28 this year. She died of leukemia when she was 4. My wife and I did not have any other children. I have not used that word, daughter, in 23 years. I do not know why I used it this morning. I am sorry that I did. I want you to know that it will never happen again. Not to you. Not to any other Marine in this battalion. Not for as long as I am in this corps." And he walked out of the tent. She did not see him again for 41 days, until the change of command ceremony at which she was formally pinned as Sergeant Major of 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, on the 22nd of September, 2011, on the gravel parade ground at FOB Edinburgh, in front of approximately 200 Marines and one regimental commander and one battalion sergeant major she was relieving, who had been notified 2 days earlier that his orders had been adjusted and that he was rotating home early to make room for a meritorious promotion that the regimental commander had described to him in a private conversation as the most justified meritorious I have signed in this command. Brennan pinned her himself. He did not say anything during the ceremony beyond the prescribed words of the promotion warrant. He did not refer, in any way, to what had happened in the TOC on the 12th of August. He did not refer to it in his end-of-tour award citation for her, which he wrote in November of 2011 and which recommended her for the Bronze Star with Combat Distinguishing Device, an award she received and which she has, to my knowledge, never worn in public and never displayed in any office she has occupied in the 14 years since. He did not refer to it in any conversation either of them had with any other Marine for the next 12 years. He referred to it exactly once. He referred to it in a sealed envelope on Marine Corps letterhead in blue ink, in his own handwriting, addressed to the President of the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps Selection Board, dated the 11th of March, 2023, and opened by the board on the 23rd of March, 2023, in a conference room in the Senior Enlisted Performance Evaluation Center at Marine Corps Base Quantico, Virginia. The sentence read, "She grabbed me. She was right. Promote her." 9 words. That was the entire endorsement. I am going to tell you what happened next. But first I need to back up again, because between the change of command ceremony at FOB Edinburgh on the 22nd of September, 2011, and the sealed envelope opened in Quantico on the 23rd of March, 2023, there are 11 and a half years, and a great deal happens in 11 and a half years to a woman whose career has just been altered. In the space of 6 SE, a trajectory off cons, from competent service to a trajectory of something else. Entirely. I want to be careful here. I do not want to give you the hagiography. The hagiography is the easy version of the false this story, and the hagiography is also ID because version. Alia Merck the account by have spoken with who served of every personiato, with her, or under her, or 1023, is not a SA above her between 2011 and Tuller kind of Marine. She is a partisan. She is a witch theses, as Marine Corps Produ, or 3 of I2 have said in any given decade, fatitations and human being with the limb, but she is also a thiegs in the bad Judad days, and the occasional be human being hwagments of any has done our job for AHM way going to try she heard that to tell you about act long time. Either way the which has run to ACC legend, Bigwali was, not prior enlisted community the last several, with the sun years in need around her and Nefer that she had. She been finished the deployment with 1st 1011. The battalion Red Battalion, a camped Marines in December of 2 ployed top Lejeune on the A which is the 10th of December, 3 days before Christmas, rulistable SC posset Marines exegeling gackley enough time to walk in for a redeployment, because gives the theses, door of their hold children, sit down at a holiday table, and disc of those in over that they how to do no longer know before things. Back to Garriton that they have to report treason, and P they do. Not have Mercado did not have a hus children. Mercado did band. Mercado had a father in on the 21st of Fownsville, Tex-Hemas, and she flew home BR to December, 2 Thurshel flight from Kamazan 11, on a Redurum Tolle, Har Houston tolling civilian clothes, with Hurin in fatherling suitcase, and her a single roll met the gate. He was, her at that point, 65 injik for BR years old. He had been 11 years datesi Heisen. In the Previ hands had biggest 2 years, to fail him in Smolenchen to his, which he tremor in thiefness in the right left, a SD had not moise, at any of their daughter in weekly phone calls during the deployment, because he had noted Harry Way from her Iden shirt about Amperanza, who called to worry, and which had he alias Seppa inviolately. Aishanovan had made explicit agreement she with her brother, because Esperanza had to know decided that. Idalia needed and Tomas had decided that she and did not. Esperanza hadly. That she was going decided, core to win that argument by simply having it without him. He was wearing a met her at the gate. He CL Gian Waitress Kyabra and PKI trousers, and the same BRT hound leather bell. He did not run had worn for 30 years he did not, her. He did not shout. Her buoyant Esperanza later own account to her that night, even smile. He walked toward her with his hands stopped 3 in his pockets, and he feet in front of her, and he looked at her face for what Esperanza later told me Idalia had described as a long time long enough that I thought he was going to say something difficult, and I started to brace for it. What he said was, Uija, she said, was ired. What? What look TM, Papa? Erazkani said was, come home. I'm Adialo. P the good kind. With the SV dash. Not be Thefren from the H cheap kind from the stripes. And then he picked up of her rolling suitcase car, and readed out the airport to his truck, and he drove her home to Kaye at the small house on he talked, the kitchen table, Andams, and he fed her Erazkan pollo at the way he had years. About talked for 31 emet Andy thing and have seen nothing. About the price everall in 19 the wee man he had known in the Union Ather in 82. And she sat across from him and eaned and did not say 8 and list of Edinburgh or about a single word about F2C or about a lieutenant colonel's collar or about a 500-pound JMD that had not landed where it had been originally aimed. And her father did not ask, because her father had not asked about her work since the day he had stopped talking for 36 hours in 1993, and they ate Eraz con pollo, and they drank coffee, and at some point after midnight she fell asleep at the kitchen table with her head on her arms, and he covered her shoulders with a blanket from the couch, and he sat across from her until morning, and he did not sleep, and he did not talk, and he watched her breathe. That was Christmas of 2011. She returned to Camp Lejeune on the 3rd of January, 2012, as the newly minted Sergeant Major of 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, the youngest battalion sergeant major in the 2nd Marine Division and one of the youngest in the entire Marine Corps. She served in that billet for 14 months, through the post-deployment reset cycle and the next workup training, and she did the work of a battalion sergeant major in garrison, which is the work that no one outside the Marine Corps understands and that no one inside the Marine Corps describes well, but which consists, in its essentials, of being the conscience and the institutional memory and the human resources department and the chaplain of last resort for approximately 900 Marines and their families, in a job that has no fixed hours and no clear boundaries and no measurable outputs, and that grinds the people who do it well down to a fine dust over the course of 3 or 4 years, after which they are either promoted, retired, or transferred to a slightly different billet where the grinding will continue at a slightly different angle. She was good at it. She was, by the account of her battalion commander during that period, a lieutenant colonel named Hollis Quinville, who had taken command from Brennan in March of 2012, and who is now a retired colonel living in Beaufort, South Carolina, and who I spoke with by telephone in 2023, the best battalion sergeant major I served with in my entire career, and I served with 7 of them. She was good at it because she did not enjoy it. She understood that the job was a burden, not a reward, and she carried it like a burden, which meant that she did not waste the energy of the battalion on her own ego, which is the failure mode of approximately 60% of battalion sergeants major. She used the energy of the battalion to take care of the battalion. That is what the job is for. She knew it from the day she pinned the chevrons on. I do not know where she learned it. I never asked. I assumed she had learned it somewhere hard, because everyone I know who learned that lesson learned it somewhere hard. She did not tell me where she had learned it. She did not, to my knowledge, tell anyone in the battalion, during the entire 14 months of her tour, that the meritorious promotion to battalion sergeant major she was wearing on her collar had been signed by a lieutenant colonel whose lapels she had held in her fists at 03:48 on a morning in Helmand Province 3 months earlier. The story did not circulate. It did not circulate because she did not circulate it, because Brennan did not circulate it, because Hartigan did not circulate it, because Croft did not circulate it, because Wexler did not circulate it, because Hargrove did not circulate it, and because the 4 other officers and the 3 NCOs in the COC who had been in the TOC that morning had collectively, without any explicit agreement, decided that the story was not theirs to tell. The story belonged to Mercado. If she wanted it told, she would tell it. She did not want it told. This is, in my experience, the most underreported phenomenon in the modern American military. The public stories are the ones that someone wanted the public to hear. And those stories are, almost without exception, the smaller stories. The larger stories, the ones that the people who were there understand to be the actually consequential ones, are protected by a kind of unspoken professional discipline, by the people who were there for decades, and most of them are never told at all, and the ones that are told slowly, in pieces, to journalists like me who have spent enough years asking enough questions in enough kitchens and on enough back porches and in enough VFW halls that the people who know finally decide, individually, one at a time, that it is time for the story to come out, and then they tell us what they know, and we assemble it, and we publish it, and we discover, almost every time, that the story is so much larger and so much more morally serious than anything the public was ever told in real time, that the gap between the 2 versions is itself a kind of indictment of how we cover wars in this country. The story of what happened in the TOC at FOB Edinburgh on the 12th of August, 2011, was protected by the people who were there for 11.5 years. It is being told to you now because Brennan, in March of 2023, decided to send a Marine Corps Selection Board endorsement, 9 words, and because the endorsement, once it was opened by the board, set in motion a chain of events that finally resulted in the story becoming, in the senior enlisted community, the kind of story that journalists like me started to hear about. I started to hear about it in the fall of 2022 from a retired sergeant major named Linwood Tarver, who had served with Mercado at Camp Pendleton in 2019, and who I had known for 15 years through my work covering the post 9/11 wars, and who called me on a Saturday morning in October of 2022 from his house in Oceanside, California, and said, in the flat, unembroidered voice he used for the things he considered important, "Hatch, there is a sergeant major you need to know about. Her name is Mercado. She is going to be the next sergeant major of the Marine Corps. There is a story behind her. Nobody is telling it. I think it is time somebody told it. I am going to give you 3 phone numbers. You do what you want with them." He gave me 3 phone numbers. One was Lieutenant Colonel Hartigan. One was Captain Wexler. One was Brigadier General Brennan, retired, in Pensacola, Florida. I started calling. It took me 6 months to get the version of the story I have just told you, and it took me another 2 years after that to get the rest of it, which is the part 1 I am about to tell you, which is the part about what happened in the Quantico conference room on the 23rd of March, 2023, when the 9-word endorsement was read aloud, and about what happened in a hospital room in Pensacola, Florida, on the 7th of November, 2023, 8 months after the board adjourned, when Mercado, by then the sergeant major of the Marine Corps in dress blues, walked into the room without an aide and without a public affairs officer and without any witness of any kind, and sat down in the chair beside the bed, and took his hand, and said the only thing she had ever said to him, in writing or in speaking, about what had passed between them on a morning in Helmand Province 12 years before. I am going to tell you what she said, but first I am going to tell you about the board. Selection boards in the United States Marine Corps for the grade of Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, the senior enlisted Marine in the entire service, and the principal enlisted advisor to the Commandant, are not, technically, selection boards. The Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps is selected personally by the Commandant from a slate of candidates assembled by a screening board of senior enlisted Marines and senior officers who review the records of every Sergeant Major in the Marine Corps and forward to the Commandant a recommended slate of typically 3 to 5 names, ranked in order of the board's preference, with supporting documentation on each candidate. The screening board convened for the 2023 slate on the 20th of March, 2023, in a conference room on the second floor of the Senior Enlisted Performance Evaluation Center at Marine Corps Base Quantico, in a single-story brick building behind the Officer Candidate School, with a view, through the conference room window, of a parking lot of Virginia pine forest and a small lot of personal vehicles. The board consisted of 7 members: the outgoing Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, who chaired, the Sergeant Major of Marine Corps Combat Development Command, the Sergeant Major of I Marine Expeditionary Force, the Sergeant Major of 2 Marine Expeditionary Force, the Sergeant Major of Marine Forces Pacific, 1 3-star general representing Headquarters Marine Corps, and 1 2-star general representing the Commandant's personal staff. They reviewed 29 records over 3 days. They reviewed Mercado's record on the morning of the 23rd of March, the 3rd hour of the final day of the board, after the light coming through the window had turned the conference table the pale gold of the Virginia pines and the smell of coffee from the partially open door to the small stone porch on which board members had been stepping out to take phone calls had begun to thin. The package was approximately 180 pages. It included her fitness reports from 2003 through 2022, 19 years of evaluations, every one of which graded her in the top decile of her grade, and 7 of which contained, as I have mentioned, the identical phrase about her silences being more informative than most Marines' speech. It included her award citations: the Bronze Star with Combat V from 2011, a Meritorious Service Medal from 2014, a second Meritorious Service Medal from 2017, a Legion of Merit from 2021. It included her professional military education record, her physical fitness test scores for 19 consecutive years, her rifle and pistol qualification scores, her deployment history, her command climate survey results from her 3 previous senior enlisted billets, and a number of supporting endorsements from officers and senior enlisted Marines who had served with her at various points in her career. The supporting endorsements were the part of the package that the board paid the most attention to, because the rest of the package, the fitness reports and the awards and the PFT scores, was, for any candidate who had made it onto the board's slate of 29, essentially uniform. Every candidate had top decile fitness reports. Every candidate had a chest full of meritorious awards. Every candidate had 19 years of 300 PFTs. What distinguished the candidates from one another at the level the selection board was operating at was the testimony of the officers and the senior enlisted Marines who had watched them work, and what those officers and senior enlisted Marines had decided, in the privacy of their own professional judgment, to put in writing about what they had seen. Mercado's package contained 12 such endorsements. 11 of them were the kind of endorsements that a sergeant major in her position would be expected to have: long, carefully composed, substantively detailed, written by general officers and senior colonels who had served with her at Camp Lejeune, at Camp Pendleton, at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot at Paris Island, where she had served a 2-year tour as battalion sergeant major of a recruit training battalion from 2015 through 2017, and at Marine Corps headquarters, where she had served 18 months as the senior enlisted advisor to the director of the Marine Corps staff in 2020 and 2021. They were strong endorsements. They used the standard vocabulary of strong endorsements: unrivaled judgment, exceptional command presence, the finest senior enlisted Marine of her generation, my unqualified recommendation for selection. They were the kind of endorsements that, in combination with the rest of the package, would have put her on any reasonable board's short list for the slate to the commandant. The 12th endorsement was different. The 12th endorsement was in a sealed envelope, addressed in blue ink to President, SGTNGMC Selection Board, eyes only, with the return address embossed in the upper left corner: BGW H. Brennan, USMC, Red. 1147, Bayou Grande Boulevard, Pensacola, Florida, 32507. The envelope had been mailed from a post office in Pensacola on the 14th of March, 2023, 3 days after Brennan had received, from his oncologist at the Naval Hospital Pensacola, the staging results from a biopsy taken on the 28th of February, which had confirmed what he had suspected since November of the previous year, which was that he had a stage 4 pancreatic adenocarcinoma, the same disease that had killed his wife in 2017, and that his oncologist's best estimate of his remaining life expectancy was between 4 and 9 months with palliative chemotherapy, or between 6 and 14 weeks without it. He had declined the chemotherapy. He had walked out of the oncologist's office on the 11th of March, 2023, with the staging report folded in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he had driven home to the house on Bayou Grande Boulevard, and he had sat down at the desk in his study, and he had taken out a single sheet of Marine Corps letterhead, the personal stationery he had ordered when he retired in 2016, and which, in 7 years of retirement, he had used exactly 3 times, once for a letter of condolence and twice for letters of recommendation for a young lieutenant who had served under him as a captain in Helmand and who had been applying to graduate school at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And he had picked up his blue ballpoint pen, and he had thought, for some unknown but evidently substantial period of time, about what he wanted to write. What he wrote. I know what he wrote because his goddaughter, not his biological daughter, the one who had died of leukemia at the age of 4 in 1988, but his goddaughter, a woman named Tessa Kilbride, who is the daughter of Brennan's college roommate at Annapolis, and who, in the years after Patricia Brennan's death, had become the closest thing Brennan had to a surviving family member, and who I spoke with at length in 2024, in her home in Arlington, Virginia, where she works as a senior staff member for the Senate Armed Services Committee. Tessa told me that Brennan had called her on the evening of the 11th of March, the same day he had received the staging report, and had told her, in a voice she described as completely calm, completely organized, the voice he used for everything important he had ever said to me in 26 years of being his goddaughter, that he had been diagnosed with the cancer, that he had declined treatment, that he had number of things he wanted to put in order in the time he had left, and that the first thing on his list was an endorsement letter for the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps Selection Board, which was convening in 9 days. She had asked him what the endorsement was going to say. He had told her that he had been working on it for 2 hours and that he had 3 drafts on his desk, each of them between 4 and 7 paragraphs long, each carefully composed in the manner of the 11 other endorsements he was certain were already in the candidate's package, and that he had concluded, looking at the 3 drafts, that all of them were wrong. She had asked him why. He had told her, because the 11 other endorsements in her package are going to say the same things mine would say, in approximately the same words, and the board has read endorsements like that 100 times for 100 other candidates over 100 years. If I write another one, it will not move the needle. The only way to move the needle is to tell the board something they have not heard before, in some form, about what actually happened in the TOC. I have not told anyone what actually happened in the TOC for 12 years. She does not want me to tell them now, but I have to tell them something, because if I do not tell them something, and somebody else does, and I die without having said the one thing about her career that only I can say, I will have failed her in the only way it is still possible for me to fail her, and I cannot allow that to happen. So I have to find a way to tell the board what I know without actually telling them what happened. I have to find a way to point at it without describing it. I have been sitting here for 2 hours trying to figure out what that looks like. I think I have figured it out. I am going to throw away the 3 drafts. I am going to write 1 sentence. I am going to tell the board exactly what they need to know and not more. The board members are senior enough to understand that 1 word that makes sense to me will make sense to them. Does that make sense to you, Tessa? She had told him yes, that it made sense to her, and she had asked him what the sentence was going to be. He had told her the sentence. She had been quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she had said, "Uncle Walker, that is 9 words." He had said, "I know." She had said, "That is going to be one of the strangest endorsements that selection board has ever read." He had said, "I know. That is the point." And then he had said good night to her, and he had hung up the phone, and he had written the sentence on the sheet of Marine Corps letterhead, and he had signed it, and he had folded it, and he had placed it in the envelope, and he had addressed the envelope in blue ink, and he had sealed it, and he had set it on the corner of his desk, where it sat for 2 days while he rested, and then on the morning of the 14th of March, 2023, he had driven himself to the post office, and he had mailed it, certified, return receipt requested, to Marine Corps Base Quantico, Virginia. The envelope arrived at Quantico on the 17th of March. It was logged in by the board's recorder, a master gunnery sergeant named Antoine Beecham, who placed it, unopened, in the section of Mercado's package reserved for late-arriving correspondence, and who flagged it for the board chair's attention because of the eyes-only notation on the envelope. It was opened by the board chair on the morning of the 23rd of March in the conference room at the Senior Enlisted Performance Evaluation Center, in the presence of the other 6 members of the board, at the moment in the deliberations when Mercado's package came up for discussion. The chair, Sergeant Major Reginald Pierpont, a man who had been Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps for the previous 4 years and who was retiring at the end of his tour, slit the envelope with a letter opener. He removed the single sheet of letterhead. He unfolded it. He read it. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he passed it, without comment, to the board member on his right, who was the Sergeant Major of I Marine Expeditionary Force, a man named Octavio Renteria. Renteria read it. Renteria passed it to the next member. The letter went around the table in silence. All 7 board members read it. When it returned to Pierpont, he set it down on the conference table, and he looked at the 3-star general from Headquarters Marine Corps, a lieutenant general named Briggs Whitlock, who I have not been able to interview for this story because Lieutenant General Whitlock is still on active duty and does not give interviews about selection board deliberations, and Pierpont said, in a voice that the other board members later described to me individually, in conversations I had with four of them over the course of 2023 and 2024. As the voice of a man who had been a sergeant major in the Marine Corps for 26 years and had never, in all that time, read anything quite like what he had just read, I think we need to talk about this one. And they did talk about it. They talked about it for 3 hours. They talked about it longer than they had talked about any other candidate in the 3 days of the board's deliberations. And they talked about it longer than the board had talked about any single candidate in the 4 previous Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps screening boards on which Sergeant Major Pierpont had served as either a member or an observer, which, by his own later accounting to me, and Pierpont, who retired in July of 2023 and who now lives in a small house on a saltwater inlet on the eastern shore of Maryland and who agreed to speak with me on background in 2024, after a chain of introductions that began with retired Sergeant Major Linwood Tarver and ended on Pierpont's screen porch on a rainy afternoon in May, was a total of 5 boards over the previous 14 years. I had never seen an endorsement like that one, Pierpont told me. I had seen short endorsements before. I had seen long endorsements before. I had seen endorsements that I thought were poorly written, and endorsements that I thought were excessively written, and endorsements that I thought were transparently political, and endorsements that I thought were quietly honest. I had read, at a rough estimate, 1,500 selection board endorsements in my career. I had never seen 9 words. I had never seen a flag officer use 9 words to tell a board everything they needed to know about a candidate and trust the board to understand. That trust was the part that stopped me. He was not telling us what to think. He was telling us that he knew we were senior enough to think it for ourselves. That is a particular kind of communication. It is the kind of communication you get from someone who is either very lazy, or very arrogant, or very certain, or very tired. Brennan was not any of the first 3, so I knew, before we started talking about it, that he was the 4th one. And I knew, because I had served with Brennan as a battalion sergeant major in 2007 when he was an operations officer at 2nd Marines, and I was the battalion sergeant major of 3rd Battalion, that Brennan tired meant something different than most men tired. Brennan tired meant that he had stripped a problem down to the bone and was handing us the bone. So the first thing I said to the board was, "Gentlemen, we are looking at a bone. Let us figure out what animal it came from." The 3 hours of deliberation that followed were not, by every account I have been able to assemble, an argument. There was no faction on the board that opposed Mercado's selection. There was no faction that questioned her qualifications. The 11 other endorsements in her package, combined with her fitness reports and her command climate surveys and her 19 years of unbroken top decile performance, had already, before the envelope was opened, placed her at or near the top of the board's working ranking of the 29 candidates. The endorsement from Brennan did not, in the strict procedural sense, change her standing. She was going to be on the slate to the commandant regardless. The question the endorsement raised, and the question the board spent 3 hours discussing, was a different question, and it was a question that does not, in my experience covering the senior leadership of the American military for 2 decades, get discussed in selection board rooms very often, because it is a question that most selection boards are not willing to discuss out loud. The question was, what kind of incident does it take for a retired flag officer, on the last endorsement he is likely to write before he dies, to choose to tell a selection board, in 9 words, that the woman they are considering for the highest enlisted billet in the Marine Corps once physically seized him by the lapels in front of his entire battalion staff and was right to do it? That was the question. And the reason the board spent 3 hours on it was that the answer to the question was not, as the board recognized fairly quickly, a question about Mercado at all. The answer to the question was a question about the Marine Corps and about what the Marine Corps wants its senior enlisted leadership to be, and about whether the institution, in the year 2023, was prepared to elevate to the office of Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps a woman whose defining act of professional judgment had been the act of laying hands on her battalion commander in front of his staff in order to prevent him from killing 31 Marines. Pierpont put the question to the board in approximately those terms in the first 30 minutes of the discussion. He did not phrase it as a hypothetical. He phrased it as the question, and he told the board that he believed the question had to be answered, on the record, in the deliberation minutes, before the slate was forwarded to the commandant, because the commandant, when he made his selection, was going to make it on the basis of the slate the board produced, and the slate the board produced was going to carry, whether the board liked it or not, the implicit endorsement of whatever moral framework the board was using to rank the candidates. If the board ranked Mercado at the top of the slate without acknowledging what was in the Brennan endorsement, the board would be passing the question along to the commandant without having answered it. And the question, Pierpont said, was too large to be passed along. The board had to answer it. The three-star general from Headquarters Marine Corps, Lieutenant General Whitlock, spoke next. Pierpont's later account of what Whitlock said is the account I am going to use here, because the other three board members I interviewed corroborated it in substantially the same terms, and because Whitlock, as I have said, has not given me an interview, and I do not want to put words in his mouth that I cannot triangulate from at least three independent sources who were in the room. Whitlock said, by Pierpont's account, that he had served as a battalion commander himself in Iraq in 2005, that he had made, in the course of that command, a number of decisions under fatigue that he was not proud of, that he had once approved a strike package on the basis of intelligence that turned out to be wrong, that the strike had killed 2 civilians, that he had thought about those 2 civilians every day for 18 years, and that the question Brennan was implicitly putting to the board, in his 9-word endorsement, was the question of whether the Marine Corps wanted, in its most senior enlisted advisor, a person who would have stopped him from making that strike. Whitlock said that he had concluded, sitting in the conference room with the letter in his hand, that the answer to that question was yes. He said that he believed every officer in the Marine Corps, every battalion commander, every regimental commander, every division commander, every commandant, needed a senior enlisted advisor who was prepared to grab his lapels when grabbing his lapels was the only thing that would prevent a catastrophe. He said that the Marine Corps had spent a great deal of time, in the previous 15 years, talking about the importance of moral courage at every level of the chain of command. He said that the institution had given a great many speeches about moral courage. He said that the institution had produced a great many leadership pamphlets about moral courage. He said that the institution had, in his observation, produced relatively few actual instances of moral courage at the senior enlisted level that he could point to as examples for the lieutenants and the captains who were coming up through the ranks. He said that what Brennan was describing, in his 9 words, was an actual instance. He said that the board had an opportunity, in the way it ranked Mercado on the slate, and in the deliberation language it forwarded to the commandant, to tell the Marine Corps that the institution recognized moral courage when it saw it, and was prepared to reward it, and was prepared to put the people who had demonstrated it into the offices where they could demand it from others. He said, by Pierpont's account, that he was going to vote to place Mercado first on the slate, with an explicit citation in the deliberation minutes to the Brennan endorsement, and that he was going to recommend, in the cover memorandum to the commandant, that the Brennan endorsement be forwarded to the commandant in its original form, in the original envelope, with the original blue ink signature, so that the commandant could read the 9 words himself and make his own judgment about what they meant. The board, after 3 hours of discussion, did exactly that. The slate went to the commandant on the 27th of March, 2023. There were 3 names on the slate. Mercado was first. The commandant, a 4-star general named Edmund Halpern, who had himself commanded a regiment in Helmand in 2012 and who had served with Brennan briefly at the Pentagon in 2008, opened the slate package on the morning of the 28th of March in his office on the 4th floor of the Pentagon, read the cover memorandum, read the 3 candidate summaries, and then opened, last, the sealed envelope from Pensacola. He read the 9 words. He set the letter down on his desk. He picked up his phone, and he called his executive assistant, and he asked her to clear his schedule for the next 45 minutes, and to find him the personal cell phone number of retired Brigadier General Walker H. Brennan in Pensacola, Florida. She found the number in 11 minutes. She brought it to him on a slip of paper. He thanked her. He closed the door of his office. He sat down at his desk. He picked up his phone, and he dialed the number. Brennan answered on the 3rd ring. He was sitting on the back porch of the house on Bayou Grande Boulevard, in the late morning sun, with a glass of iced tea on the wicker table beside him and the yellow Labrador asleep at his feet. He had been expecting the call, although he had not known, until the phone rang, whether it would come from the commandant himself or from one of the commandant's senior aides. He had hoped, in the small way that a dying man hopes for the small dignities he has not earned and does not deserve, but would, all the same, appreciate, that the call would come from the commandant. The call came from the commandant. The conversation lasted 19 minutes. I do not know what was said in the conversation, because the commandant has not given me an interview about it, and Brennan, by the time I came to interview him in May of 2023, was already in the early stages of the cognitive decline that the cancer and the pain medications had begun to produce, and his recollection of the conversation was imperfect, and I do not want to misrepresent what he was able to tell me. I know that the call took place. I know that it lasted 19 minutes, because the commandant's executive assistant, who is a master sergeant whose name I have agreed not to publish, confirmed the duration to me in a brief email exchange in late 2023. I know that at the end of the call, Brennan said thank you, sir, and the commandant said thank you, Walker, and the call ended. I know one other thing about the conversation. Tessa Kilbride, the goddaughter, told me that Brennan called her later that same evening, on the 28th of March, 2023, and told her that the commandant had called him, and that the commandant had selected Mercado, and that the announcement would be made publicly in approximately 10 days, after the standard administrative processes for the selection were completed. Tessa asked him how the conversation had gone. Brennan said, by her account, he asked me one question. He asked me whether I would still have written the endorsement if she had been wrong about the coordinates, if the strike had been correct and her platoon had not been in danger, if she had grabbed me for no reason. I told him I would have written it anyway. He asked me why. I told him because the willingness to do it is the thing. The correctness is the consequence. You promote the willingness. The Marine Corps will sort out the correctness on its own, but it cannot sort out the willingness. That has to come from the person. And then he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, that is the answer I was hoping you would give. And then he said thank you. And then he hung up. Tessa told me that she was quiet on her end of the line for a long time after he told her that. She told me that she had asked him, finally, Uncle Walker, is that really what you believe? He had said, yes. She had said, even though, if she had been wrong, the strike would have killed 4 Taliban fighters that needed to be killed, and your battalion would have had a successful operation, and nobody would ever have known the difference. He had said, Tessa, the Marine Corps does not promote senior enlisted Marines on the basis of outcomes. It promotes them on the basis of character. Character is the thing that produces the right action in the moment when the outcome is unknown. The commandant understands that. I understand that. Mercado understands that. The people who do not understand that are the people who should not be in the offices where these decisions get made. The commandant called me to confirm that I understood it. I confirmed that I did. That is the conversation we just had. It took 19 minutes because we are both old men and we wanted to be sure of each other before we said goodbye. She told me that she had said, "Uncle Walker, was that goodbye?" He had said, "Tessa, everything is goodbye now." The announcement was made on the 7th of April, 2023. The Marine Corps released a brief press statement at 1400 Eastern, posted to the official Marine Corps website and circulated through the standard public affairs channels, announcing that the Commandant of the Marine Corps had selected Sergeant Major Idalia Mercado, currently serving as the Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Commander, U.S. Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command, to succeed Sergeant Major Reginald Pierpont as the 19th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. Effective on the date of her formal assumption of the position, which was set for the 8th of August, 2023, at a relief and appointment ceremony at the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. The announcement was approximately 400 words. It described her career in the standard biographical summary. It listed her major awards. It noted that she would be the first woman to hold the office in the history of the Marine Corps. It did not mention Brennan. It did not mention Helmand. It did not mention the TOC, or the strike package, or the friendly forces overlay, or the 6 seconds, or the 9 words. There was no reason for any of those things to be mentioned in a public announcement. They were not the public business. They were the institutional business, and the institution had handled them in the way the institution handles things it understands to be important, quietly, internally, and without fanfare. The press picked up the announcement. The press wrote the stories the press writes about historic firsts. The stories were correct in their facts. The stories were thin in their substance. The stories described her as a barrier breaker, as a trailblazer, as a symbol. The stories did not describe her as the woman who had grabbed a lieutenant colonel by the collar at 0348 in a TOC in Helmand 12 years earlier, because the press did not know that story. The press did not know that story because the story had been protected for 12 years by the people who had been there, and because the announcement had not unprotected it, and because the only person who could have unprotected it, Mercado herself, did not give interviews, and the only other person who could have unprotected it, Brennan, was, by the time the announcement was made, 4 months into his diagnosis and 7 months from his death, and was not, in those last months, talking to the press. He was, in those last months, talking to me. I told him I understood the distinction. I am trying, in the way I am writing this story, to honor the distinction. I do not know if I am succeeding. The temptation, in a story like this one, is always to dramatize the smallest and most cinematic moments. The 6 seconds in the TOC, the 9 words in the envelope, the phone call from the commandant, at the expense of the larger and slower and less cinematic work that the smaller moments are anchored in. The smaller moments are what make the story readable. The larger work is what makes the story true. A good story about an institution is a story that honors both. I am trying to write a good story. By August of 2023, Brennan was no longer well enough to sit on the back porch for more than 30 or 40 minutes at a stretch. He had lost approximately 35 pounds since I had first met him in May. The cancer had begun to involve his liver and his spine, and the pain, which he had refused to manage with anything stronger than oral acetaminophen for the first 3 months of his diagnosis, had become, by mid-July, sufficient that he had agreed, under pressure from Tessa Kilbride, to begin a regimen of oral morphine. The morphine slowed him down. He was aware that it slowed him down. He scheduled our visits, increasingly, for the mornings before his first dose of the day, when he was, by his own assessment, clearest and meanest and most useful to you. On the morning of the 8th of August, 2023, Sergeant Major Idalia Mercado was formally appointed as the 19th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps at a ceremony at the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. The ceremony was attended by the Commandant, by the outgoing Sergeant Major Pierpont, by approximately 300 Marines and family members, by a small press contingent, and by Mercado's father, Tomas, 81 years old, in a navy suit and a white guayabera shirt and a brown leather belt that he had owned for 40 years, who had flown from Brownsville the day before with his sister Esperanza, and who sat in the front row of the bleachers and did not speak during the ceremony, and did not, at the small reception that followed, give any interviews to any of the reporters present, although he did, by the account of a Marine public affairs officer I spoke with afterward, accept a handshake from the Commandant, and, when the Commandant told him that his daughter was the finest senior enlisted Marine the Commandant had ever served with, nod once, and say, in slow, careful English, "Yes, sir. I know." Brennan watched the ceremony on a live stream on his laptop, on the back porch, with Tessa Kilbride sitting beside him and the Labrador at his feet. He did not attend in person. He had not been invited, formally, because Mercado did not know that he was dying. He had asked Tessa, specifically, not to inform her, because he did not want Mercado's first weeks in the office to be shadowed by the obligation of a deathbed visit, and he could not, in any case, have made the trip. He watched the ceremony from 09:30 to 10:45 local, and at the moment when Mercado, having been pinned, walked to the microphone to make the brief remarks that the ceremony protocol calls for the new sergeant major to make, Brennan, by Tessa's later account to me, set down his coffee mug and folded his hands in his lap and leaned forward slightly toward the screen. Mercado's remarks were 3 minutes and 17 seconds long. I have watched the video myself. She thanked the Commandant. She thanked the outgoing Sergeant Major. She thanked her father in Spanish and in English. She thanked, by name, for senior enlisted Marines who had mentored her over the course of her career, none of whom were named in the press coverage afterward because none of the reporters present recognized the names. She did not mention Brennan. She did not mention Helmand. She did not mention the TOC. She made one statement that I want to quote to you in full, because I believe it is the only public statement she has ever made that bears, even indirectly, on what happened on the morning of the 12th of August, 2011, and I believe she made the statement, on that ceremony stage, in the knowledge that Brennan was watching, and I believe she made it for him. She said, "The Marine Corps does not exist to make any individual Marine into a hero. It exists so that, on the worst morning of the worst week of the worst deployment of your life, when the people you are responsible for need you to see something that nobody else is willing to see, you will have been trained and trusted and given the room to see it and to say what you see and to be heard. That is what this uniform is for. That is what these chevrons are for. That is the only reason any of us are here. Semper Fidelis." She stepped back from the microphone. The ceremony moved to the playing of the Marine Corps hymn. The live stream cut away to a wide shot of the parade ground. Brennan, on the back porch in Pensacola, did not say anything for a long time. Tessa told me that she did not look at him directly because she had learned, over the course of his illness, that he did not like to be observed when he was working through something difficult. She sat beside him and looked at the screen. Eventually, after some minutes, he said, in a voice that she described as quiet but completely level, "Tessa." She heard the question. She answered it. "We are done now." Tessa asked him what he meant. He said, "The Commandant asked me, in March, why I had written the endorsement. I told him because the willingness is the thing. She just told 300 Marines and the entire Marine Corps that the willingness is the thing. She used different words. The words do not matter. She heard the question. She answered it. That is the whole transaction. That is the whole story. We are done. He closed the laptop. He did not, for the remaining 95 days of his life, mention the matter again to Tessa, or to me, or to anyone else that I have been able to identify. He had said the thing he had to say. He had heard the thing he had to hear. The transaction, in his own framing, was complete. He was admitted to the Naval Hospital Pensacola on the 18th of October, 2023, for management of pain that had escalated beyond the capacity of his home regiment, and he was transferred to the Covenant Hospice House on Bayou Boulevard on the 2nd of November, after his oncologist had told him, in plain terms, that the hospital had nothing further to offer him, and that the hospice would be a more humane setting for the time he had left. On the morning of the 7th of November, 2023, for days before he died, Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps Idalia Mercado walked into his hospice room. She came alone. She came without an aide. She came without a public affairs officer. She came without a driver. She had flown, on a commercial flight, from Washington Reagan to Pensacola the previous evening, in her dress blue uniform with her ribbons and her chevrons and her name tape reading Mercado, and she had rented a car at the airport, and she had driven herself to the hospice, and she had walked through the front door at 0900 local, and she had asked the receptionist for the room of Brigadier General Brennan, and the receptionist, who did not recognize her and did not understand the significance of the chevrons on her collar, had given her the room number, and she had walked down the hall, and she had knocked on the door, and Tessa Kilbride, who had been sitting beside his bed, had opened it. Tessa told me about this morning 11 months later, in her home in Arlington, in the spring of 2024. She told me that she had recognized Mercado immediately, although she had never met her, because she had seen the ceremony footage in August, and because Brennan had, in his last weeks, kept a small framed photograph of Mercado in her dress blues on the table beside his bed, which Tessa had not known the provenance of until that morning. Mercado said, by Tessa's account, "Ma'am, my name is Idalia Mercado. I am the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. I am here to see the General. I understand that he is not well. I will not take more than a few minutes of his time. May I come in?" Tessa said yes. Tessa stepped back from the door. Tessa looked at Brennan, who was awake, propped on two pillows, with the morphine drip in his left arm and the oxygen cannula at his nose and his eyes, which had become very pale in the last weeks, focused now with a clarity that Tessa had not seen in him in some days, on the woman in the doorway. Tessa said, "Uncle Walker, the Sergeant Major is here," Brennan said, in a voice that was not strong but was perfectly clear. "Tessa, please give us the room." Tessa stepped out. She closed the door behind her. She sat down in a chair in the hallway, approximately 10 feet from the door, and she waited. What was said in the room, between Sergeant Major Mercado and Brigadier General Brennan, retired, in the 11 minutes the door was closed, is known to me because Mercado, on her way out of the hospice approximately 40 minutes later, after Brennan had fallen asleep and after she had spent some additional time sitting with him in silence, stopped in the hallway in front of Tessa Kilbride and looked at her and said, "Ma'am, the General told me, before he fell asleep, that he wanted me to tell you what we said. He said you would want to know. He said you had earned the right to know. I am going to tell you. I would ask that you not share it with anyone outside the family for as long as he is alive. After he is gone, you may do with it what you think is right." And then she told her. And Tessa Kilbride, 11 months later, in her living room in Arlington, with a cup of tea cooling on the table between us and a photograph of Brennan in his Marine Corps combat utility uniform on the mantelpiece behind her, told me. Tessa Kilbride told me what Mercado had said and what Brennan had said. In the 11 minutes the door was closed, and I am going to tell you now, because that is what Brennan asked Tessa to do, and that is what Tessa, after his death, decided, in her own judgment, was the right thing to do, and because I have promised you, in the way a writer promises a reader at the beginning of a story this long, that I would not withhold the thing the story has been moving toward. I want to tell you, before I tell you what was said, what the room looked like. Tessa described it to me carefully, because she had been sitting in it for 9 days at that point, and she knew every detail of it. It was a small room, perhaps 12 feet by 14, with pale yellow walls and a single window facing east, overlooking a small garden of azaleas and live oaks. There was a hospital bed against the long wall, with the head raised at approximately 30 degrees. There was a small armchair upholstered in blue cloth beside the bed, on the right side, which was where Tessa had been sitting. There was a wheeled bedside table on which sat a plastic pitcher of water, a paper cup, a small box of tissues, a paperback copy of Marcus Aurelius that Brennan had been reading in the mornings before the morphine made reading impossible, and the framed photograph of Mercado in her dress blues. There was a television mounted on the opposite wall, which Brennan had asked the staff to turn off on his first day and which had not been turned on since. There was a small whiteboard on the wall by the door on which the day nurse had written, in green marker, the date and the names of the staff on shift. There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums on the windowsill, which Tessa had brought the day before from a florist on Bayou Boulevard. There was a faint smell of antiseptic and of the lemon-scented cleaner the housekeeping staff used in the hallways, and underneath those smells, the smell that Tessa described to me as the smell that hospice rooms have, which is not a bad smell, but which is a smell you recognize the second time you walk into a room that has it, because you remember it from the first time, and you know what it means. Mercado walked into the room. She closed the door behind her. She did not approach the bed immediately. She stood, for some seconds, with her back against the closed door, and she looked at Brennan, and Brennan looked at her, and neither of them spoke. Then she walked to the bed. She did not take the chair Tessa had been sitting in. She remained standing, at the right side of the bed, at a distance of approximately 2 feet from his shoulder, with her hands at her sides, in the position of attention that a Marine in uniform assumes when reporting to a senior officer. She said, "Good morning, sir." Brennan said, "Good morning, Sergeant Major." She said, "Sir, I came as soon as I heard. I am sorry I did not come sooner. I was not informed of your condition until 2 days ago, when Master Gunnery Sergeant Beecham at Quantico passed me a message through a mutual acquaintance. I would have come in May, if I had been informed in May. I would have come in August, if I had been informed in August. I want you to know that I would have come." Brennan said, "I know, Sergeant Major. I asked Tessa not to inform you. The decision was mine. I did not want you to feel the obligation. You have an office to run. I did not want to be a distraction from the office." She said, "Sir, you are not a distraction. You have never been a distraction. I want to be clear about that." Brennan said, "I know." There was a silence then, by Tessa's account of what Mercado later told her, of perhaps 15 or 20 seconds. Mercado remained standing. Brennan remained propped on the pillows. The morphine drip ticked in the corner. The yellow chrysanthemums sat on the windowsill in the morning light. Mercado said, "Sir, I came to tell you one thing. I have been thinking about how to say it for the entire flight down from Washington. I have not, in 12 years, found the words for it. I do not know if I have found them now, but I am going to try, because I do not think I will have another chance, and I do not want to leave it unsaid." Brennan said, "Sergeant Major, take your time." She said, "Sir, on the morning of the 12th of August, 2011, in the TOC at FOB Edinburgh, I put my hands on you. I have thought about that morning, in some form, every day for 12 years. I have not, in those 12 years, regretted what I did. I want you to know that. I would do it again. I would do it again if the situation were identical, and I would do it again if the situation were not identical, but the principle were the same. That is not what I came to tell you. What I came to tell you is something different. What I came to tell you is that what you did in the 6 seconds after I let go of your collar is the thing that made it possible for me to do my job for the next 12 years. Do you understand what I mean by that, sir? Brennan said, "Tell me what you mean." She said, "Sir, when I put my hands on you, I had made a decision. I had decided that the strike was going to kill my Marines, and that the only way to stop it was to do what I did, and that whatever happened to me afterward was less important than what was going to happen to those 31 Marines if the strike went through. That was my decision. I made it. I was prepared to live with whatever consequences came. What I was not prepared for, sir, was for you to do what you did. I was not prepared for you to look at me in front of your entire staff and ask me what I had seen. I was not prepared for you to listen to what I told you. I was not prepared for you to call the strike off. I was not prepared for you to write a 4-sentence promotion endorsement at 0600 and put it on the colonel's desk before breakfast. I was not prepared, sir, for the institution to behave the way you made it behave that morning. I had served 8 years at that point. I had never seen the institution behave that way. I had been trained to expect that the institution would punish what I had done, and that the punishment would be deserved, in some technical sense, even if the act itself had been correct. I had made my peace with that expectation before I crossed the room. And then you did what you did, and the expectation turned out to be wrong. And I have spent 12 years trying to understand what it meant that the expectation was wrong. Brennan said, "And what does it mean, Sergeant Major?" She said, "Sir, it means that the institution is what the people inside the institution decide to make it, in the moments when the decision is theirs to make. It means that there is no institution separate from those decisions. It means that every officer who has ever told a junior Marine that the institution would not tolerate a particular kind of dissent was, in that moment, the institution and was choosing, in that moment, what the institution would and would not tolerate. It means that you, sir, on the morning of the 12th of August, 2011, in the 6 seconds after I let go of your collar, decided what the Marine Corps was going to be, for me, for the next 12 years of my career. You decided that it was going to be an institution that could be grabbed by the collar when the grabbing was necessary, and that would respond to the grabbing by asking what the grabber had seen. You did not have to decide that. Sir, you could have decided something else. Most officers, in my experience, would have decided something else. You decided what you decided, and I have spent 12 years trying to be the sergeant major that your decision deserved. That is what I came to tell you. I came to tell you that I know what you did, and I know what it cost you, and I know that you have never asked me to acknowledge it, and I am acknowledging it now, because you are dying, and because if I do not acknowledge it now, I will not have the chance, and I am not willing to live the rest of my career without having said it to you, out loud, in a room with the door closed, in the uniform you made it possible for me to wear." She stopped. She did not, by her later account to Tessa, cry. She did not, by her later account, raise her voice. She had spoken the entire sequence in the level and unhurried voice of a sergeant major reporting to a senior officer, in the same voice she had used in countless command briefings and after-action reviews and command climate sessions over the course of 20 years. Brennan was quiet for a long time. The morphine drip ticked. The chrysanthemums sat in the light. Tessa, in the hallway, heard nothing through the door because the door was solid and the voices on the other side of it were low. Eventually, Brennan said, "Sergeant Major, sit down." She sat down. She took the chair Tessa had been sitting in. She placed her cover on her knee. She put her hands on top of the cover. She waited. Brennan said, "Sergeant Major, I want to tell you what I have been thinking about for 12 years on my end of this. I want to tell you because I do not have time to write it down, and because I do not trust anyone else to relay it correctly, and because you deserve to hear it from me. Are you willing to listen?" She said, "Yes, sir." Brennan said, "Sergeant Major, on the morning of the 12th of August, 2011, you saved 31 of my Marines. That is the fact. That is the part of the story that gets told. When the story gets told, which I expect will be soon, because there is a journalist in Washington who has been asking questions for some months, and I have decided to help him ask them, because the story is going to come out one way or another, and I would prefer for it to come out correctly. The 31 Marines is the part that the public, when they hear the story, will understand. The 31 Marines is the cinematic part. The 31 Marines is the part that the journalists will write about, and that the Marine Corps will, eventually, make a small film about for the recruit depots, and that the lieutenants at TBS will be told about in their leadership classes. The 31 Marines is the easy part. I want to tell you about the hard part, which is the part that I do not believe has ever been said to you by anyone in 12 years. She said, "Yes, sir." Brennan said, "Sergeant Major, the hard part is that you also saved me. You saved me from being the officer who, on the morning of the 12th of August, 2011, killed 31 of his own Marines because he was too tired to read the grid coordinates correctly. You saved me from the briefings I would have given and the letters I would have written to 31 families and the investigation I would have sat through and the relief from command I would have received and the early retirement I would have taken and the 40 years I would have spent in a small house somewhere, drinking, thinking about what I had done. You saved me from that life. You gave me, instead, the life I have actually had, 12 more years of command, a promotion to flag rank, a retirement with dignity, a marriage that ended in love rather than in estrangement, a goddaughter who sits beside my bed and reads to me, a dog at my feet, a view of a bayou in the morning, and the chance, in the last months of my life, to write 9 words on a sheet of letterhead and put them in an envelope and mail them to Quantico. You gave me all of that. You gave it to me at 03:48 in a TOC by putting your hands on my collar when there was no one else in the room with the rank or the position or the courage to do it. I have been trying, for 12 years, to figure out how to repay that. I have concluded that it cannot be repaid. It can only be acknowledged. The endorsement was the acknowledgement. The endorsement was 9 words because 9 words was the most I could fit into the gap between what I owed you and what the form of the document would allow me to say. The endorsement was not me promoting you. The endorsement was me, finally, after 12 years, telling the institution out loud what you had done. The institution heard me. The institution made you the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. That is the only thanks I had left to give you. I am telling you, now, that the giving of it was the most important thing I did in 41 years of service. More important than any operation I planned. More important than any unit I commanded. More important than any star I was given. The 9 words were the thing. The 9 words were what the career was for. Do you understand what I am telling you, Sergeant Major? She said, "Yes, sir." Brennan said, "Tell me what I am telling you." She said, "Sir, you are telling me that we saved each other." Brennan said, "Yes, Sergeant Major. That is what I am telling you." She did not say anything for a long time. Brennan did not say anything either. The morphine drip ticked. The chrysanthemums sat in the windowsill. Patton the Labrador was not in the room. He was at the house on Bayou Grande Boulevard, where Tessa's husband was looking after him. But in Mercado's later telling of the conversation to Tessa, she said that she had thought, in the silence, of a yellow Labrador that she had never met but had seen in a small photograph on Brennan's bedside table when she walked in. And she had thought of her father in Brownsville at the kitchen table with arroz con pollo, and she had thought of a young Lance, corporal in a TOC 22 years earlier in Quantico, whose pencil she had sharpened in a quiet voice. And she had thought of a colonel named Holloway, whose name she had not spoken aloud in 20 years. Then she said, "Sir, may I do something that is not in any regulation?" Brennan said, "Sergeant Major, at this point in my life, you may do anything you wish." She stood up. She placed her cover on the chair. She walked the 2 steps to the side of the bed. She bent down. She took his right hand, which was the hand without the morphine line, in both of her hands. She held it. She did not shake it. She held it, the way a person holds the hand of another person whom they have known for a very long time and will not see again. And she held it for what Mercado later told Tessa was perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a minute, perhaps longer. She did not know. She held it until Brennan, whose eyes had closed at some point during the holding, opened them again and looked at her and squeezed her hand once, weakly, with what strength he had left. Then she let go. She straightened up. She picked up her cover. She placed it under her left arm. She came to the position of attention at the side of the bed. She rendered him a hand salute, slow and precise, the kind of salute that a senior enlisted Marine renders to a flag officer at a formal ceremony. And she held the salute, and Brennan, in the bed, with what strength he had left, raised his right hand to the brim of an imaginary cover and returned it. And she dropped her salute, and he dropped his, and she said, "Semper Fidelis, sir." He said, "Semper Fidelis, Sergeant Major." She turned. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the doorknob. She turned back, one last time, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "Sir, thank you for the 9 words." He said, "Sergeant Major, thank you for the 6 seconds." She opened the door. She walked into the hallway. She closed the door behind her. She did not, by Tessa's account, go directly to the parking lot. She walked back into the room some minutes later, after composing herself in a small lounge at the end of the hall, and she sat in the chair beside the bed, in silence, for approximately 30 additional minutes, while Brennan slept. She did not speak. She did not touch him again. She sat. When she stood to leave, she adjusted the blanket over his shoulders, and she straightened the framed photograph of herself on the bedside table by perhaps half an inch, and she walked out, and she stopped in the hallway, and she told Tessa what had been said, and she walked to the parking lot, and she drove to the airport, and she flew back to Washington on the late afternoon flight. And she was in her office at the Pentagon at 0700 the next morning, in a fresh uniform, doing the work the office required her to do. Brennan died at 0214 on the morning of the 11th of November, 2023, for days after Mercado's visit, with Tessa Kilbride asleep in the armchair beside his bed and the night nurse in the room and the yellow chrysanthemums on the windowsill, somewhat wilted by then, but still yellow in the low light from the hallway. He did not regain full consciousness in those 4 days. Although he spoke, on the morning of the 9th of November, the single word Patricia, which was the name of his wife who had died 6 years earlier, and which Tessa took to mean what she had been hoping, all along, that it would mean. He did not speak again after that. His breathing slowed over the course of the 10th of November. It stopped at 0214 on the 11th. The nurse noted the time. Tessa woke. She sat beside him for an hour. She called the funeral home at 0320. She called the Marine Corps Casualty Office at 0400. She called me at 0615, knowing I was an early riser, and she said, in the level voice that I had come to recognize as the voice she had inherited from him, "Mr. Hatch, he died at 2:14 this morning. He went easy. The condition you agreed to is now released. You may publish when you are ready." His funeral was held on the 18th of November, 2023, at Barranca's National Cemetery on the grounds of Naval Air Station Pensacola in a light rain with full military honors. The commandant attended. The outgoing and incoming sergeants major of the Marine Corps attended, although by that point the outgoing was the incoming, because Pierpont had retired and Mercado had assumed the office, and so Mercado stood in the front row of the mourners in her dress blues with a black mourning band on her left arm, beside the commandant, in the rain, without an umbrella, while the Marine Corps band played the hymn and the firing party rendered the 3 volleys, and the bugler played taps, and the flag was lifted from the coffin and folded into 13 folds and presented by a Marine Corps lieutenant in white gloves to Tessa Kilbride, who received it on behalf of the family, because Brennan had no surviving spouse and no surviving children of his own. After the ceremony, after the official party had dispersed and the press had left and the family had moved to the small reception in the chapel, Mercado walked, alone, in the rain, across the wet grass of the cemetery, to the headstone of Patricia Brennan, which was located approximately 40 yards from the open grave where her husband had just been interred, and she stood at the headstone for some minutes. I do not know what she did there. I was at the reception with Tessa, and I did not see her go. Tessa saw her go. Tessa did not follow her. Tessa told me, the next morning, that she had watched Mercado walk to the headstone and stand at it, and then walk back, and that when Mercado returned to the chapel her uniform was soaked through from the rain, and her hair was wet, and her face was composed, and she had said nothing about where she had been. She had stayed at the reception for 40 more minutes. She had spoken with Tessa, briefly. She had spoken with the commandant. She had spoken with 3 retired colonels who had served under Brennan in various commands. She had not spoken with me, although she had, when our paths crossed in the chapel corridor, met my eyes for perhaps 2 seconds, and had nodded once, in a way that I have spent the months since trying to interpret, and that I have concluded I am not entitled to interpret, because the nod was hers and not mine. She flew back to Washington that evening. She was in her office at 0700 the next morning in a fresh uniform, doing the work the office required her to do. She is, as of the writing of this story in the late summer of 2024, 10 months into her tour as the 19th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. She has given no interviews. She has made no public statements about Brennan beyond the brief official condolence the Marine Corps released on the day of his death. She has, by every account I have been able to gather from people who work with her, performed the duties of her office with the same quiet and unrelenting competence with which she performed every previous billet of her career. She is, by general consensus in the senior enlisted community, the most consequential sergeant major of the Marine Corps in at least 20 years and possibly longer. The commandant has, on 3 separate occasions in the past 10 months, made unscripted public remarks in which he has described her as the finest senior enlisted Marine he has ever served with, the same phrase he used to her father at the reception in August of 2023. Her father, Tomas Mercado, is still alive. He is 82 years old. He still lives in the small house on Calle Adams in Brownsville. He no longer lays brick. His hands have continued to fail him in the small ways that they began to fail him in 2011, and they will, in the next several years, fail him in larger ways. His daughter calls him every Sunday evening. They speak in Spanish. They speak for, on average, 22 minutes. He does not ask her about her work. She does not tell him. They speak about the weather in Brownsville and the weather in Washington and the price of cement and a man he knew in the Union Hall in 1982 and the arroz con pollo he is going to make her when she comes home, which she does, when her schedule permits, 3 or 4 times a year on commercial flights, in civilian clothes, with a single rolling suitcase, and he meets her at the gate, in a clean white guayabera and pressed khaki trousers, and the same brown leather belt he has, worn for 40 years, and he does not run to her, and he does not shout, and he does not smile, and he walks toward her with his hands in his pockets, and he stops 3 feet in front of her, and he looks at her face for a long time, and he says, "Mija, you look tired." And she says, "I am, Papa." And he picks up her suitcase, and he carries it to the truck, and he drives her home, and he feeds her arroz con pollo at the kitchen table, and he talks about everything and nothing. And she sits across from him and eats and listens and does not say a single word about Quantico, or about the Pentagon, or about a hospice room in Pensacola, or about a yellow Labrador, or about a flag folded into 13 folds in the rain on the 18th of November, 2023, and her father does not ask, because her father has not asked about her work since the day he stopped talking for 36 hours in 1993, and they eat arroz con pollo, and they drink coffee, and at some point after midnight she falls asleep at the kitchen table with her head on her arms, and he covers her shoulders with a blanket from the couch, and he sits across from her until morning, and he does not sleep, and he does not talk, and he watches her breathe. That is the story. I have told it as honestly as I know how to tell it. I have told it because Walker Hollis Brennan, on a back porch in Pensacola in May of 2023, asked me to tell it, and because Tessa Kilbride, on a morning in November of 2023, released me from the condition under which it had been entrusted to me, and because I have come to believe, in the years I have spent assembling it, that the story is one of the small number of stories about the post 9/11 American military that is large enough and morally serious enough and human enough to be worth the room it takes on the page. I have not contacted Sergeant Major Mercado. I will not. If she wishes, after reading this, to respond, she knows how to reach me. If she wishes not to respond, I will respect that, in the way that everyone who was in the TOC at FOB Edinburgh on the 12th of August, 2011, respected her silence for the 12 years between that morning and the morning a retired brigadier general in Pensacola, with 9 words and a sealed envelope and a stamp from the local post office, decided that the silence had served its purpose and that the time had come, finally, for the institution to speak. The institution spoke. The institution chose her. She is, as I write this, the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. She will hold the office for 3 more years. She will retire. She will go home to Brownsville, or to a house somewhere quiet, and she will not give interviews, and she will not write a memoir, and she will not, as far as anyone who knows her can predict, ever speak in public about any of what I have just described. That is her right. The story belongs to her. It always did. I have only been holding it, on her behalf, for as long as it took the people who were there to decide that it was finally time for it to be told. It is told now. Semper Fidelis.